Good evening. I'd like to call the meeting to order and welcome you to the regular meeting of the Milwaukee Planning Commission. Agendas and additional copies of staff reports are available on the table in the hall. If you have not picked up an agenda, please do so. It contains important information about the process. If you wish to be included in the mailing list for a decision, please add your name and contact information to the sign-up list located on the table in the hallway. If you wish to testify, please also fill out a yellow comment card. We will follow the basic format listed on the back of the agenda. It includes all of the hearing procedure steps. We may vary from the process based on the specific circumstance of each hearing. Okay. Next on the agenda is, we don't have any minutes, so skip that. Informational items. Any informational items from staff?
Sure, I guess I can knock these out now. The next meeting of the Comprehensive Plan Advisory Committee is next Monday, March 4th, 6 p.m. at the Public Safety Building. We also have the Design and Landmarks Committee are also meeting that night, 6:30 p.m. at Pond House? Here at Council Chambers. And we'll be providing an update at the next meeting on the comprehensive plan, specifically on the housing policies.
All right. Next on the agenda, audience participation. This is an opportunity to comment on items not on tonight's agenda. If you wish to comment on an item that is on the agenda, there will be a time for comments after the presentation. Does anyone wish to comment on an item that is not on tonight's agenda? All right. Next agenda item is a public hearing on Bonaventure Senior Housing Facility. The public hearing on Bonaventure Senior Housing Facility is called to order. The purpose of this hearing is to consider application number CU-2018-003. The purpose of this application is to request a community service use and variances on property located at 13333 Southeast Rusk Avenue. The applicant has the burden of proving that the application is consistent with the City of Milwaukee's zoning, subdivision ordinance, comprehensive plan, and any applicable municipal code provision. The applicant has the burden of proving that the proposal conforms with all of the city's applicable criteria. I now ask staff to cite the zoning ordinance sections where the criteria can be found.
Thank you. This Milwaukee Municipal Code Chapter 19.1000 for review procedures, including Type 3 review in MMC 19.1006. Title 12, Streets, Sidewalks, and Public Places. Chapter 13.14, Stormwater Management. Section 14.08.090, Conditional and Community Service Use Signs. Title 17 for Land Division, Title 18 Flood Hazard Regulations, Section 19.301 Low Density Residential Zones, including the R10 zone, Section 19.302 Medium and High Density Residential Zones, including R3, Section 19.402 for Natural Resources, Chapter 19.500 Supplementary Development Regulations, Chapter 19.600 for Off-Street Parking and Loading, Chapter 19.700 for public facility improvements, Section 19.904 community service uses, Section 19.905 conditional uses, and Section 19.911 for variances.
All testimony and evidence must be directed toward the applicable substantive criteria. Failure to address a criterion or raise an issue with sufficient detail to allow the Planning Commission an adequate opportunity to respond to each issue precludes appeal to the City Council based on that issue. Failure to raise a constitutional or other issues related to proposed conditions of approval with sufficient detail to allow a response precludes an action for damages in circuit court. Any party with standing may appeal the decision of the Planning Commission to the City Council. Persons with standing are those who submit written comments or testify in person or sign the Planning Commission attendance sign-up sheet in the hallway. I will recognize those persons who have completed the testimony cards and given them to me. When you come to the podium, please state your name and address for the record so they may be entered into the minutes. If you're here to testify, please remember to confine your remarks to the application and the relevant criteria and to avoid repetition and irrelevant information. If additional documents or evidence are provided by any party, the commission may, if requested, allow a continuance or leave the record open to allow the parties a reasonable opportunity to respond. Any such continuance or extension shall be subject to the limitations of the 120-day rule unless the continuance or extension is requested or agreed to by the applicant. Maybe someday I'll have that memorized.
Never, you won't.
It's a lot. Okay. Conflicts of interest in site visits. So I'm going to ask my fellow commissioners, does any member of the Planning Commission wish to abstain from this hearing?
No.
Does any member of the Planning Commission wish to declare an actual or potential conflict of interest?
No.
Did somebody say yes?
Yes.
Oh, yes, okay.
During a prior land use application for this same site 2 years ago, I, in my involvement as a volunteer for the Oak Grove Community Council and the North Clackamas Urban Watersheds Council, reviewed the land use applications and gave some testimony before the Planning Commission during that land use application review process. And since then, so when this application came through, as a member of the Planning Commission, I have isolated myself from any of the discussions of any of the material evidence related to this land use application. And so I believe that I have preserved my impartiality for this review.
Okay.
Thanks, Joseph.
Does any member of the Planning Commission wish to report on any ex parte contacts?
No. Yes. So, as visitors to many of our local NDA meetings, which you can find online at www.milwaukeeoregon.gov, I was at the Lake Road meeting when they brought up this particular subject. The chair, Vince Alvarez, brought it up, left it on the table, and I did remind them that if they were going to have a discussion, that it was going to be at the Planning Commission during this date.
Okay. Does anyone have any rebuttal to the ex parte contacts declared by the commissioners? Will any commissioner who has visited the site prior to this hearing please raise their hand? Did any of those commissioners who visited the site speak to anyone at the site or note anything different from what is indicated in the staff report for this application?
No.
Does any member of the audience wish to challenge the participation of any member of the Planning Commission? Does any member of the audience wish to challenge the jurisdiction of the Planning Commission to hear this matter? All right, let's proceed to the staff report presentation.
All right, good evening, Chair Travis, Commissioners. I'm Brett Kelver. I'm an Associate Planner with the City of Milwaukee, and I'll walk you through this application this evening. So I guess one note in case there's any confusion, the title that we've given this project is Bonaventure Senior Housing. It's for a senior housing development. The organization that is proposing it, their name, I believe, is actually Bonaventure Senior Living. So sometimes there may be some confusion about whether or not we're talking about the organization or what we're calling the project. But for what it's worth, this is a proposed senior housing development by Bonaventure. And the site is the Turning Point Church site on Rusk Road near the Highway 224 intersection. This in general is in the southeast corner of the city. It's adjacent to North Clackamas Park, which is to the west, and the Milwaukee Center. The site is surrounded by unincorporated Clackamas County, and so a lot of the zoning around the periphery of the site is for county designations. Excuse me. But it is, in fact, inside the city limits of Milwaukee, and the property, interestingly, has a split zone designation. The eastern half, which includes the actual church building and parking lot, is zoned for low-density residential R10. The western half, which includes much of the wetland area, is zoned R3, and I believe this relates to an earlier proposal from several decades ago when there was a proposed zone change in conjunction with another senior housing development. The zone change was approved. The senior housing development was also approved but was never built, but the zoning remains in place with that split designation. So the site itself is comprised of 4 different legal lots of record, and part of the proposal would consolidate them and then kind of redraw the boundary to establish the church and its parking area on its own lot to leave the rest of the larger property for the senior housing development. Now, this portion of the process, this land division, the boundary adjustment, lot consolidation, was also a part of the project that Commissioner Edge mentioned from 2 years ago. The proposed plan development also included that step. That was handled outside of the hearing 2 years ago and was approved, but it was never acted upon because, as some of you may remember, that larger application was withdrawn. And so even though the previous lot consolidation and property line adjustment were approved, they weren't acted upon, and since then, those approvals have expired. But essentially, that part of the proposal is the same as it was before. So the site does have some significant natural resource designations on it. Mount Scott Creek flows across the northern portion of the site, and see if I can use my cursor here. There. So this kind of green area represents more or less the channel of the stream, and there's an associated 50-foot water quality resource, or WQR, boundary on either side of it. And then this more orange outline represents the boundaries of a designated habitat conservation area, or HCA, that kind of is more or less consistent with the FEMA mapped area of the 100-year floodplain. Interestingly, our current habitat conservation area designation does not include all of the existing mature oak woodland that's in the southwest corner of the site, and part of the applicant's proposal is to update the HCA boundary, and they presented some analysis that does, in fact, while it reduces some of the HCA areas closer to the creek, it does extend farther into the southwest corner to encompass all of the oak woodland there. So the project itself is for senior housing. It's a total of 170 units that would be available for seniors. It's essentially intended to provide a place for people to age in place. So there are a combination of independent living units that have their own kitchen, so a person could kind of make their own meals, and it would be essentially kind of like an apartment. They also would have available some of the facilities that are there for other residents. For example, the assisted living suites have a very basic, kind of not full kitchen setup, and the residents in the assisted living units would take their meals in a common dining room area. And then there are some memory care units as well. So folks who need a lot of assistance and basically kind of secured in the facility, folks who are dealing with Alzheimer's and other memory-related ailments. So in order to accommodate all those uses and to try to minimize the footprint of the building on the site, the applicant has proposed a multi-story building, including one story where the memory care units would be, which are kind of represented here, and then a combination of 3- and 4-story portions of the building for the assisted living and the independent living suites. Here's a view of the kind of the original site plan. So you'll see the boundary, the new proposed boundary of the lot for the church boundary containing all of the parking on that site, and then the senior housing development kind of spreading across the eastern portion of the site with a perimeter road going around for access, for loading and unloading, for fire safety, and also just for kind of the mobility of the folks on the site. Access to the site would be primarily through a driveway on Kellogg Creek Drive. The church currently It would retain its current driveway on Rusk Road. It currently has a driveway also that empties out onto Kellogg Creek Drive. It would be losing direct control of that driveway and would retain an access easement with the senior housing property so that it would continue to have access in and out from Kellogg Creek Drive. There would be some changes to this driveway that I'll discuss in a moment. And in general, some of the public improvements that are proposed as part of the project include improvements on Kellogg Creek Drive. Right now, there is a curb-tight sidewalk. The proposal would include some dedication of property to the public right-of-way in order to establish a kind of a new curb line, landscape strip, and setback sidewalk for much of the frontage. As you get closer to, they're not shown on this part of the plan, but as you get closer to the to that stand of trees in the southwest corner, the applicants proposed a crossing, so the sidewalk would essentially cross the street and use the sidewalk on the south side of Kellogg Creek Drive in order to not have to make any further disturbance to the trees there. There's also a proposal for a two-way bike path kind of along the church frontage to make a connection from the intersection here with Highway 224 and Rusk Road all the way to Kellogg Creek Drive and into the park. And then kind of a proposal and requirement as part of this project would include extending and kind of establishing actually finally a formal right turn lane on Rusk Road at the intersection with Highway 224 to try to alleviate some traffic there. We'll talk a little bit more about some of those improvements in a bit. So the church has a small part in this proposal in terms of needing some review. The changes that are proposed to the overall property do result in some minor changes to the church. There's no proposal to change anything about the capacity of the church. There's no addition physically to the building. There is actually no loss of parking spaces. It's really just drawing a boundary around that part of the site the church is using, with the exception of this kind of the shared driveway that they'll, like I said, retain a shared access to. But it does require some approval as a minor modification to the church as a community service use. Some of the things that are involved in that review, by drawing a property line kind of just on the outside of their parking area, this does become now an official perimeter landscaping area. It does require some trees as part of the landscaping requirement there. The driveway from Rusk Road, the county, which has jurisdiction of both Rusk Road and Kellogg Creek Drive right now, would really like to see the driveway close. The city recognizes that with this land use proposal, since nothing is really being proposed that would change the church in terms of its capacity, we feel that that's too much of a requirement. But what will be required is to formally make this driveway basically an in only, and in fact a right in only, so that there's less conflict here at this driveway with the traffic on this portion of Rusk Road. So that's a part of the minor modification approval as well. A couple of requests that accompany this proposal. There are 3 variances that are requested. One is for building height. The proposed building height is just over 45 feet. It's approximately 48 feet. And again, because of the split zoning on the site and the different types of approvals that are needed for these 2 types of use, there is a requirement for a variance to allow the building to exceed the normal height requirement. There's also a requirement for walkway connections into the site, 1 for every 300 feet of frontage. The applicant's providing 2 connections on the Kellogg Creek Drive frontage. The site does technically have just a little bit of frontage here on Rusk Road, so the standard would require some kind of a pedestrian connection here. The applicant's requesting a variance to not make that connection to maintain a little better control of access to the site, and they can explain a little bit more about their thinking with that if there are questions. And then the third variance relates to a requirement for the nursing and convalescent home aspect of the project, which is how we're considering the memory care part of it. Those kinds of facilities are required. It's either that, or it may be the senior and retirement housing. There's a requirement normally that those facilities provide access onto a collector or arterial street. And in this case, obviously the site has very limited frontage on Rusk Road. That frontage is right at the intersection. There's no way that we would be allowing a new access way at this portion of the site. It makes a lot more sense to have access onto Callow Creek Drive, and staff's assessment in conjunction with kind of the transportation impact study that was provided by the applicant is that that the improvements that we'll be getting on Callow Creek Drive with the bike path and with the turn lane on Rusk Road make it appropriate to allow that portion of the facility to access onto a local street. But there is a variance that's formally required for that. And then, in addition, the parking requirements in our code for this combination of facilities, the senior retirement housing and the nursing convalescent home for the memory care part of it, would require approximately 160, 170 parking spaces. The applicant's proposing to provide less than that. Their experience shows that they don't need that many parking spaces, and I think there's also, again, some acknowledgement that providing a little bit less parking allows them to reduce the impacts to the natural resource area, so they've kind of asked for a modification to the parking requirement as part of the application. So some of the issues that we identified as key ones for discussion in the staff report relate to the floodplain, to the impacts to the natural resource area, and also transportation. And we'll talk just briefly about those, and then if you have questions about them, you can feel free to ask. So the current map that FEMA provides for the floodplain shows a couple of features here. I'll point out there's the floodway itself, which is a highly critical area that generally follows the channel of the creek itself. The bluish area is designated as the 100-year floodplain, and then the orange shows kind of the larger 500-year floodplain event. Now, the applicant has, we understand that that FEMA maps, they do provide a base flood elevation for different sections of the stream. The mapping itself is not always highly accurate because of the level of review that FEMA is doing. And so what the applicant has done is they've taken the base flood elevation and the modeling information from FEMA and applying that to this site itself and the contours that are on the site. They're proposing to revise FEMA's map in accordance with procedures to redefine more accurately for this site the 100-year floodplain. And this dark line shows what they're proposing as the 100-year flood area. You can see that with that in mind, there's essentially no impact in the revised floodplain area. And the applicant can explain more about their methodology for that. But there is a formal procedure that they will need to go through with FEMA. This CLOMR and LOMR, those are acronyms for Conditional Letter of Map Revision and a formal final letter of map revision. The applicant intends to make those applications with the approval if they get approved for the project, and they recognize that they're kind of, all of this is at their own risk. If for whatever reason the mapping that they've done, the methodology that they've used does not in fact get approved by FEMA, that they may have to return to the city for a new approval, but they feel fairly confident that with the base flood elevation that FEMA has provided and their mapping that is more accurate. So the image just shows kind of by comparison the more gross FEMA overlay based on their rough data, and then again over here the applicant's revised understanding of the floodplain area.
Brett, can I follow up? Is that required by city rules that you're not allowed to be inside the floodplain, or is it particularly by action of variance?
Well, as I understand it, we do have the Title 18, which is our flood hazard regulation title, that is the city's way of implementing some of the larger federal rules at the local level. And so if someone proposes to do development in the floodplain, they have to do other analyses. They have to show that they're balancing the amount of cut in the floodplain with fill. And so if the applicant was proposing to do that, as they were, not this applicant, but as was proposed 2 years ago with a different project, they were going to have to demonstrate that they could balance the cut and fill, for example. So they were kind of on a different track because they were acknowledging that they were going to be making some disturbance and having some impact in the floodplain itself. So does that answer?
That gets it,
okay.
Yes.
Okay.
They would have to come back with a cut and fill if their map wasn't
right
appropriate, if they continue with the same design.
That's my understanding. Yeah.
Okay.
With respect to the question of natural resources, this is a map from the applicant's natural resource review report that shows, I'll try to point out a couple things here as I understand them, that shows this is the kind of going through the detailed verification process for the HCA area. The applicant's redrawn the HCA line along Mount Scott Creek. It also extends around, there's a kind of around the wetland that's delineated here. You see it includes now the oak woodland. And you can see the crosshatched areas showing where there is some proposed impact to our either water quality resource areas or habitat conservation areas. You can see primarily around kind of within the wetland buffer. There's a little bit of impact in the wetland itself, and then mostly it's within the water quality resource buffer around that. Here on the north side, you can see there's some impact. These are some covered parking spaces that are close to the building. Underneath here, there's some more uncovered parking spaces. You can see a couple of the stormwater facilities. This is again in the original proposal. Some of the stormwater facilities, all three of them had some or all within the impact area, and that was an issue that was noted by ESA, the city's on-call natural resource consultant, and there was a suggestion in their memo that there maybe be some adjustment, that maybe the stormwater facilities could be relocated to reduce some of the impact, and there was a suggestion that some of the parking spaces, especially on the north closest to the riparian corridor here, be relocated or eliminated. And the city did kind of what was in our recommended conditions was that there be a look at this and an attempt to shift. And the applicant has provided a revised site plan, which I passed out a hard copy. There are a few hard copies up here if anyone in the audience wants to see one, and I've got a slide with it as well. And we'll get to that in just a little bit. I wanted to point out as well, this is based on the unchanged or kind of the original site plan showing impacts. I'm not sure how much would change with respect to tree removal. This is a diagram showing the different trees that would be removed, and looking at the list of trees that are provided in the applicant's report. I confirmed again today there are no oaks that are proposed for removal. So there are several different other species of trees that are proposed for removal, but of all the oaks on the site, none of those are proposed for removal. And there may be some adjustment. The applicant can maybe speak to this. There may be a couple trees in areas that were previously proposed for some kind of impact. If that impact is shifting, that may mean that a couple more trees stay there. But you can see that in general, the footprint with the perimeter road and some of the structure does involve the removal of a few trees. As mitigation for the proposed impacts, and again, this is based on the original site plan, so there may be some adjustment based on revised impacts. This green area is showing the area where there's a proposal for planting, again, native trees and shrubs, so kind of enhancing the areas closest to the creek and around the wetland where there's not impact proposed. And depending on what the commission decides about what's an acceptable level of impact to the natural resource area, if any, we expect that there would be maybe some adjustment to the number of plantings and perhaps the location of the mitigation area. So that can be discussed further, and the applicant may have more information as well. This is the graphic showing the revised site plan. So the areas in red are showing kind of the new proposed, for example, stormwater areas. So originally there was a stormwater facility proposed here, and you could see this section of it was going to be within the habitat conservation area. It's been proposed to relocate that stormwater facility outside the HCA. The same here. This is the original proposed stormwater facility. It's now been reoriented to be shown outside of the HCA. And here as well, this entire stormwater facility was going to be inside the HCA and close to the wetland. It's been relocated farther away from that area. There is also this area of parking spaces has been removed and shifted down to the southern part of the site, closer to the memory care unit. So the applicant has responded in part to the ESA and to the city's suggestions about doing other things to reduce impacts. There are still some impacts with parking here and in this area close to the building, but that's a question that the commission can discuss and the applicant can address as well. With respect to transportation, again, I guess I'll just note that this shows a little bit more of the western end of Kellogg Creek Drive. So with the new main entrance of the facility onto Kellogg Creek Drive, we'll be getting a separated sidewalk with a landscape strip. We've worked with the applicant to design a turnaround area, since Kellogg Creek does dead end into the park, but to provide a little bit more of an area for vehicles to turn around that aren't accessing the park. And then the proposal has the new sidewalk stopping short of the woodland area and crossing folks to the south side to the existing sidewalk on Kellogg Creek Drive there to continue into the park. There's some question about whether we would, I think we may just be able to leave the existing curb tight sidewalk here. I think if there's a question, our engineering department can speak to that. But the idea again was to try to avoid any further impacts by right-of-way improvements to the woodlands here. And then the applicant is required, because of the impacts that the project will be having on the local transportation system, one requirement is for the project to provide some kind of a bicycle connection from the Rusk Road 224 intersection, basically across the frontage of the property to the park. In the previous proposal, the plan development proposal, which did involve the creation of some new city streets, the applicant was proposing to move the bikes through the development. There are a number of options or a number of ways that an applicant could make this kind of connection. The applicant could have provided a public easement with a bike path kind of coming through their facility somehow. What they've opted to do is, working with the church, is to propose a kind of a separated bike path that would be, for the most part, just on the frontage, kind of on the church property along Rusk Road, coming around to make a connection, dropping folks onto the street in the bike lane here on Kellogg Creek Drive. And there's a recognition that that should work fairly well for bikes going westbound into the park. There's an acknowledgement that there needs to be a little further design to figure out how to safely cross cyclists who are eastbound up onto this facility.
Does the revised site plan, does that make it 12-foot wide? Or is it still only 5 foot?
I don't believe so, but the applicant might have some
Okay.
further. I didn't scale that out. It's a fair question.
Thank you.
So I think the original bike path was shown as maybe 5 feet wide, and I think both the county and the city's requirements for it to be a two-way bicycle facility are going to want it to be at least 10 feet wide. So that is one of the conditions that we're proposing there. And then with this particular project, the level of impact that was determined through the transportation impact study isn't quite as great as the townhome development that was proposed before. So we're not able to technically require the right turn lane here at Rusk Road by virtue of new impacts, but the city recognizes that this is an important improvement that is needed for this intersection. So even though the TIS, the Transportation Impact Study, doesn't conclude that it's required, the city is requiring it, and by way of acknowledging that it's not, technically required, we're in a position to be able to give some system development charge credits to the applicant for constructing it. So it's a little bit of, I guess, technicality there, that it is essentially a condition, a requirement of the project, even though it's not technically warranted by the impacts to this. So it is an improvement that we'll be getting regardless. Now, what I've done, I guess without walking through all these, I have several slides that are here for your reference as you get into your discussion about the different sets of criteria. There are two main applications. For the use itself, the conditional use is required for the independent living and the assisted living units as senior retirement housing. And then the memory care aspect of it is being considered as a community service use. So in the findings, we've addressed all these different criteria. In general, the conditional use standards are about demonstrating that the location and the use are appropriate in scale and in the facilities that they'll provide for that use to function without undue impacts that can't be mitigated. So in general, the staff's finding and assessment of this was that both for the conditional use aspect and the community service use aspect, that the use itself is approvable for this location. And so just for reference, here are the standard approval criteria for conditional uses that you can refer back to if needed for your discussion. And then specifically for the senior retirement housing piece of it, there are some additional considerations that the commission can make regarding, in large part, pedestrian access to the site, and also, again, considering impacts to the surrounding area. So those are all things that you can include in your deliberation. The community service use criteria, again, are focused on the memory care aspect, and they involve ticking through the underlying zone requirements, again, looking at public benefits versus negative impacts, considering the hours of operation, the levels and intensity of use, and the general appropriateness of the location. And again, the staff conclusion is that these uses are appropriate for the site with the different requirements and conditions that have been imposed. For natural, for natural resource review, the couple of general considerations are the applicant's required to provide a report that looks at the impacts and evaluates them, that considers some alternatives to this project and weighs them against their proposed alternative, and then along the way demonstrates how this proposal in particular avoids the impacts to the resource as much as possible. Where it says it can't avoid them, it at least tries to minimize them, and then presents a plan for mitigating for the impacts as well. So this is something that we can come back to. I guess the staff conclusion based on the assessment the ESA provided was that there did appear to be an opportunity to further reduce impacts in line with the suggestions the DSA had about shifting the locations of the stormwater facilities, trying to relocate or eliminate some of the parking. And so the condition that we've proposed is that the applicant make that effort to make some adjustments. They have with this, to some degree, with the plan that they've submitted. And so as part of your discussion, you can determine whether it seems like there are additional alternatives that should be considered and can consider the mitigation as well. For the three variances, in general, the criteria are about, again, looking at an analysis of the impacts of the variance, and then coming to some conclusion that the request is reasonable and appropriate, and that it does at least one of these three things: that it avoids or minimizes impacts, has some kind of public benefit, or responds somehow to the site or the conditions in a creative way. And then also with a demonstration that there is, if there are impacts, that there's some mitigation for them. And for each of the three variances, our conclusion was that that they all meet those criteria, and we can discuss those further if you have questions about them. Can certainly do that. The parking modification is also kind of has a general reasonableness standard. There's a look for some information and analysis, a comparison from other jurisdictions, or some presentation of data about similar uses to make the case that the proposed change in parking, in this case a reduction in the minimum required parking, is reasonable and won't have any impacts, any negative impacts on the surrounding area. And based on the data and information that the applicant presented and their experience with similar facilities and other locations, it was our conclusion that the amount of parking that was proposed, the modification, was appropriate. So, for example, we don't anticipate there to be a need for a lot of on-street parking on Kellogg Creek Drive related to the facility. So in general, I'll conclude with this. The staff recommendations are to approve the use aspects of the application, so the community service use and the conditional use, to approve the natural resource review with some revisions to the site plan to further reduce impacts and make adjustments to the mitigation plan as needed, and then to approve the other applications as well. So the variance, the parking modification, the transportation review, and the land division parts of it, as well as the minor modification piece to the church's community service use. And so just a parting note on some of the key conditions that we're recommending, again, relate to revisions to the mitigation plan and the site plan to reduce impacts to the natural resource area, and to, to work sensitively with the mitigation plantings with respect to some of the existing previously done restoration and plantings on the site, especially there's some young oaks on the site. A key recommendation is widening the bike path to 10 feet for safe travel. in response to a question that was asked by Commissioner Edge prior to the hearing, there's a recommendation to provide some additional bicycle parking for residents of the independent living units, and in addition to provide some carpool parking spaces, and as well just to confirm the requirement for the right turn lane extension at the Rusk Road 224 intersection. So with that, kind of your standard options are to approve the application set with conditions and findings that we've recommended. If you have some discussion that results in some changes, another option is to make sure we get those in the record and approve with those in mind. If you feel like you need more information based on the information I presented, what you hear from the applicant, public testimony, there's time on our land use clock to continue the hearing to a future hearing date. Or if you're not convinced that the application meets some or all of the different applications approval criteria, we can rewrite the findings for denial. So with that, I'll ask if you have any questions for now.
Any questions for Brett? Why don't we just go in order?
Okay. Brett, thank you for that. A lot of work has gone into this, and I appreciate it. In this 600 pages of content, I ran across something kind of interesting that said that the site, this was in a report from Redmond Geotech that said that this site had construction debris deposited on it at some point. And so the recommendation from Redmond Geotech was to remove that construction debris back to the topsoil. And I really didn't see that addressed about, is that a requirement? How does that, if in fact, I don't know if the developer has agreed to do that. It was a recommendation. I don't know if you considered this or not. And my concern here is that is about, if there's a lot of stuff here that's going to affect the permeability of the soil, then that might have some effect on the WQR and HCA's. Are you familiar with this one, or?
Yeah, as part of the plan development review a couple years ago, this question came up. There were reports of illicit and illegal fill on the site, and so there was some discussion of this issue and a look into what, if anything, the city was in a position to do about that. And in general, the conclusion was that that we really didn't have a way to exactly require kind of full restoration or somehow verify kind of what a more original state of the site was. And I think both with that proposal as well as with this one, and the applicants can probably speak a little more to this, I would imagine that there will be some, there's likely to be some reconfiguring or working with the soils that are in place, at least where the building is going to go, and maybe to a lesser degree where the road is going to be, in terms of, part of the geotech aspect of it is making sure that their facility is going to be stable and sound. And so I'm not sure, maybe they can speak a little bit more to what they understand might have to be done in order for them to have to establish a sound building and other improvements like the roadway. With respect to the question, I guess, of potential impacts to the natural resource areas, I think that might be a good one to try to follow up on with the applicant team as well. My understanding, based on the site plan and the proposed grading and changes of contours, is that, again, for the most part, avoiding impacts to those areas may alleviate some of the concerns, but I guess I don't have the expertise beyond that to know what if any affects some of the stuff, as you describe it, that might be in the ground, how that might affect the resource, how it has been maybe up till now, and what changes might occur as a result of some development. So I don't have a good answer.
Thank you. We'll revisit that.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
So the pathway that crosses over Kellogg Creek, is that before or after the driveway of the other assisted living across? It looks from the overhead that if you look at where the Oaks ends, it would actually end up being right in the middle of the driveway. And so I just didn't know which side of that, do you know?
me see if I can get they're a little far apart. I'm not sure I have something that zooms in very well with in an aerial way. I might be best to look at that site. So I think this is, as I understand it, let me get my cursor back here. This is showing the driveway entrances, I think, to the assisted living.
So on the overhead, is that the tree then that is? I just get a little confused about.
Well, I think the short answer to the question is I believe, and
It's on
again, I
the
think
other
the
side.
applicant team can answer this a little more confidently. I believe the crossing point is west of the driveways for the assisted living.
So for us directionally challenged, the park side.
The park side.
Okay.
Yeah.
And do we know how big that other assisted living facility is across the way? How many units?
I don't offhand. No.
Can we actually suggest to reduce impacts that we can go higher in the stories, or is that bound by a certain amount of rule? Instead of going 4 stories, going 5 and shortening up the buildings?
Yeah, I think we're in variance territory here. So the applicant's already requested relief from the building height standards. So the door is open. If kind of at the commission's direction, they wanted to adjust their request to go higher than 4 stories. I think we have a vehicle for that. So yes, that could be done. And that may be a fair question for the applicant. There may be some structural
Right.
costs
I don't know
involved with
what the right
going
answer is.
from
I
4
was
to
just
5.
wondering if there was a restriction.
No, I think the
by the
variance
city.
could be for 5, 6, 7 stories. Yeah.
And then the applicant has, what I can tell from their revised site, in the habitat conservation area has what I would call manicured lawns, green space. Technically, does the city consider that still habitat conservation? Or is that separated because there's a parking lot in between?
Let me make sure I understand what you're asking. You're saying with what's shown as habitat conservation area right now?
Yes, or what the green line is, the habitat conservation line. If you look, I would assume that the white shaded areas are manufactured lawn or lawn areas. Does that still count as habitat conservation areas technically by rule, or?
Well, I don't know. Is this the best drawing to help illustrate what you're?
I don't know. I'm kind of just looking at this one with the green line. The new proposed drawing.
The new site plan.
There you go. So you see how it's like light gray in between the darker gray, in between the parking lot? Yeah.
So point me to an example where you want.
Go closer to the, man, now I got to put on my glasses so I can read this. FFE 76.70. Right, yep. Keep going a little bit to the west. The other west.
Whoops, the other one.
There you go. Up. The east of the parking lot, west of the building.
Here.
Okay, right there.
I see.
Right, manufactured.
Okay,
Is that
right.
considered habitat conservation area because it's green lawn?
Well, so to understand where we're starting, so if you kind of envision the building gone, and we're back to just the site and this dashed line showing habitat conservation area right now it is considered a protected natural resource area. The applicant is basically requesting or proposing to impact it. So I think the way to answer your question is it's considered HCA right now, but the request is to basically permanently impact it and take it out of the HCA designation. So a manicured lawn area, I think unless the applicant wants to propose that maybe that area be a smaller kind of native vegetation restored area, which isn't what I understand the proposal to be. I suppose there might be, if they did that, they might make an argument that it's only being temporarily disturbed to create the surrounding structure and that it should remain as a habitat area.
So for city rules, a manicured lawn does not make it comparable back to habitat conservation area?
Well, you're required to, when you're doing mitigation plantings for disturbance, you're supposed to use native species,
Okay,
trees and
all right.
shrubs and ground cover. And so what I understand is that your basic kind of lawn grasses are not usually,
Okay.
they're usually invasive, actually considered kind of an invasive
Okay, all
species.
right, thank you.
We'll go down here and I'll go last. Commissioner Argo?
I'm
You
looking
good?
at some
Okay.
stuff. So I just had a question about the parking modification request.
Okay.
And the, one of the criteria is that it is for the smallest reduction possible or necessary. The requested reduction is smallest reduction needed based on specific circumstances. So, and what I was seeing in the findings is that we're being requested to approve a range of, acceptable, an acceptable parking ratio range. But this specifically says the smallest reduction needed. And so I'm just wondering how we're supposed to apply that.
Right, good question. Yeah, I might have to talk with the city attorney about that or look at the code language a little bit more carefully, because I guess my understanding is that the applicant has, in general, kind of correctly applied the logic or the thinking that what they're suggesting is a modified range, what would be an appropriate minimum and maximum, and then they're showing themselves being somewhere in the middle of that, as you explained. So I suppose if we dig into this a little bit, if I take a look at the code and see if what we're supposed to conclude with a modification request is an actual single number for that use, then I suppose the question would be, is that number that the applicant's proposing, in this case 139 spaces, is that the right number? So maybe we can take a look at that, and if you can keep it on your radar, we'll try to come back to that. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll just wait for the further testimony before asking any questions.
Okay.
So I have a question about the applicability of 19.505.3 multifamily housing. I guess I'm a little bit confused about the designation of this property and the design guidelines that are included in here, and kind of references throughout to institutional property. And so I just in general have a question about including multifamily standards here, and whether, obviously you deem that to be applicable, but I'm having trouble with that.
Right. So I think that's a fair question, and I appreciate the opportunity to explain that a little bit. I think our understanding is that this is not a multifamily project, and so technically those multifamily design standards and guidelines are not applicable. But the staff suggestion or recommendation was that since in some ways it feels a little bit like, or looks a little bit like, a multifamily type development, that it might be useful for the applicant to tick through those guidelines as a way of showing that they believe that their development, even though it's not technically a multifamily development, is providing a lot of those design features and amenities that we would expect to see in a multifamily development. Since there are some aspects of it that, even though we're considering it kind of overall a type of institution, there are aspects of it that do have kind of an apartment type of feel. So it was a suggestion to address it in consideration of the community service use and the conditional use aspects, and not intended to be something that they needed to demonstrate compliance with those standards. Does that make sense?
I think so.
Okay.
And then a question about access, and I guess really we didn't receive any comments from emergency services, or I don't know what they're formally called here.
Well,
the fire department
fire district,
provided, but
yeah.
they didn't really provide any comments. They said standard comments, so I didn't see those anywhere. But I think in terms of like access on the site, through the site, to get where emergency vehicles need to be, and I didn't see that addressed. And I guess I'm also a little bit, in terms of the church with access point, and during, the frequent whenever the services are, Sunday or whatever day, just that, the possibility that emergency vehicles may not have adequate access.
So is your concern about maybe the widths of drive aisles or choke points? Or what are you-
Both,
Okay.
yeah.
So the Clackamas Fire District did review the project, and they provided their comments, which typically relate to having access, kind of water supply and access in general. And their, I guess, requirements are included as part of the conditions, the recommended conditions, in the additional requirements section. So we have a couple parts of the conditions piece. The first part is what we consider things that are needed as conditions to be able to approve the project. And then, beyond that, we have an additional requirements section that gets at, hey, here are some things that you're going to need to do. And so in general, you might find some general answer to your question there, or at least knowing that they've provided the applicant with a list of the requirements that are going to be meaningful to them. So with that in mind, I guess my general sense or answer would be I don't think the fire district in particular was concerned with access, at least for the firefighting part of things.
Okay. Thank you for pointing that out. Now I see that
It's a little buried back
It
there.
is a little
Yeah.
buried. Thank you. I think that's it. Did anyone else have any questions for Brett at this time? All right. Thank you. Next. Buried.
Just like you got everything all dug out, now you got to get back in there.
Have we received any correspondence on this matter other than those items included in the meeting packet?
We have. Earlier today, we got an email from Catherine Krieger of the North Clackamas Parks and Recreation District. I have a few copies up here if anyone wants to see it, with a few comments about additionally trying to reduce impacts to the HCA and WQR, and some interest in working with the park to make like a trail connection along the creek. And then just earlier this evening, received a comment from, I believe it's Caroline Bruneau, 12942 Southeast Rusk Road. Copies of both of these were distributed to you at the dais here this evening, but those are the two comments that we've received since the latest staff report. Additionally, I would say that I also did provide at your seats two exhibits, staff recommended kind of last minute revisions. One is to the findings, one is to the conditions. The findings document, the addition is an address of one of the sections of the Natural Resource Code that I omitted in the original findings. It just kind of talks about when you're doing a property line adjustment with natural resource, looking at opportunities to try to reduce the difference in the percentage of HCA on one or another. And then the conditions exhibit, and I have copies up here if anyone wants to look at these as well, just tries to include a little bit of language that we felt needed to be in there, because the county has jurisdiction right now of both Rusk Road and Kellogg Creek Drive, but there's an awareness that the city would like to obtain jurisdiction at least of Kellogg Creek Drive in the near future. And when that happens, we'd like to make sure that we're able to, at this point, to get the kind of the standards built the way the city public works standards say they should. So there's some language there. And then also I'd neglected to include one of our requirements of the requiring a 5-foot bike lane on Kellogg Creek Drive, which is shown on the site plans and has been kind of part of the concept from the beginning. I also, there's some text on the second page of this conditions document that's deleted and just kind of moved to a different section, goes from, it's D9, it just moves to F by itself, since that body of conditions had to do more with Kellogg Creek Drive improvements.
Thank you. Any questions on these items? Okay. Okay, now we'll have applicant testimony.
Chair Travis, can we take a quick break to like 5 minutes
Okay,
before the applicant presents?
yes.
Thank
Right.
you.
Take a quick break. right. Staff, are we ready? Okay. All right. We're back from our brief break and ready for the applicant testimony. If you could please state your name and address for the record, please.
Good evening. I'm Sarah Breakstone. I'm a senior planner with Dowell. Prepared this land use application. It's good to be back. 720 Southwest Washington Street, Portland, Oregon, 97205. With me tonight, Daniel Dobson with Bonaventure Senior Living. We also have Scott Emmons. He's a senior civil project manager with Dowell. John Van Stavern from Pacific Habitat Services. They prepared the natural resources report. And Christine Connolly, senior traffic engineer with Kittleson. They prepared the traffic study. So we're all here tonight to answer all your questions. We do have kind of a really quick presentation, mostly to talk about some of the conditions of approval. But I think before we get into that, Dan would like to just say a few words, just kind of give you a brief overview of the project.
Good evening. My name is Daniel Dobson. I live at 5172 Bates Street Southeast in Turner, Oregon, 97392. Just want to come introduce myself. I've been in the development arm of Bonaventure, been with that company for almost 11 years now. We're a family of companies dedicated to the development, construction, and operation of exceptional senior living communities. So we have Bonaventure Senior Housing as our development arm, Bonaventure Senior Living is our operations arm, Bonaventure Construction is our construction arm. So there's a myriad of companies that are involved with this project. We were established in 1999 and we're headquartered in Salem, Oregon. We've developed 49 communities, primarily in Oregon and Washington. And we look forward to building such a community here in Milwaukee. We provide a gracious, comfortable home designed and built to accommodate the senior lifestyle of our residents, complete with supportive services to make life rewarding and carefree. Our seniors enjoy a friendly, well-trained staff, a wide variety of activities, first-rate chef-prepared meals, and personalized services tailored to individual needs. Seniors require often a continuum of care that ranges from independent living on the one end of the spectrum to full-service care that includes a thorough understanding of the challenges associated with memory loss. We provide all this under one roof so our residents can experience a seamless continuity of care. As Brett said earlier, Bonaventure of Milwaukee will include 78 independent living suites, 60 assisted living suites, and 32 memory care suites. So we're happy to present to you today and look forward to all your questions.
Great. Thank you. I will launch into our discussion about the conditions of approval. I definitely want to take a minute to thank Brett and Denny and all of the city staff for all their help in this process and all their coordination and communication and responsiveness. So really appreciate it. Generally, agree with the findings in the staff report. We do have a couple questions about some of the conditions. The first one being one that you've kind of already started to talk about, which is condition 1A, that requires us to revise the site plan to shift off-street parking and stormwater facilities out of the HCA. So we have provided a preliminary revised site plan that we wanted you to take a look at tonight. Brett showed it to you already. I'll show it to you again. What that does is take 10 parking spaces from that northern HCA area and relocate them south outside of the HCA. And it also takes the 3 large storm facilities that are currently inside the HCA and reconfigures and relocates them so that they are outside of the HCA, reducing our HCA impacts by about 0.43, so almost half an acre. Brett already showed this to you, but this is what it looks like. I think, you know, the way the condition is written is somewhat vague, so I think it would be helpful for us to get some guidance from the commissioners on, you know, whether or not these revisions are going to satisfy that condition of approval, because the condition doesn't specify numbers or percentages or anything like that. So we feel that the changes that we made or that we will make to the site plans reduce HCA to the extent that we'll meet this condition, but I think we need some feedback from this group. Condition 2C is the condition that requires that bike path that currently goes from the intersection of Rusk and 224 down along the church property and then west to the park. That bike path is currently shown as 5 feet wide, and the condition is to make it 10 feet in width. We're requesting that you allow this path to stay at 5 feet. It was specifically designed so that it, you can kind of see it here. Well, not very well. It's designed so that it kind of moves around the trees that are existing along that frontage of the church property. And the way it's designed now, no trees have to be taken out to build it. If we go to 10 feet, trees are going to need to be removed. It's also the same width as the width that would be required if we were putting an on-street bike lane on Rusk. There's not enough right-of-way on Rusk to do that, but the width there would be 5 feet. Alternatively, per Clackamas County's comments, the minimum width for a two-way bike path is 8 feet. So alternatively, we would request that at a minimum that condition be reduced to 8 feet instead of 10. That will allow preservation of some of those trees, probably not all of them. Condition 3C has to do with perimeter landscaping, and I think what we were looking for here is just a little additional clarification, and Brett actually provided some of that clarification to me via email this morning, so I think we're okay on this one. The question was, the language is, he feels there are some additional perimeter areas that need to have trees. Does this cursor work?
Keep sliding it kind of to the right. You have to kind of, there you go.
Oh, there we go. This isn't a landscape plan, so you can't see, but right now we're proposing trees, 1 per 40 feet along the perimeter of this newly established property line here, and on this one, on both sides of the property line, so trees along the church property line and trees along the Bonaventure property line. I think Brett was suggesting that perhaps this area here should also be considered perimeter, and that we could put some trees in there. And I don't think that we have any issue with that, and he's clarified that. And he also talked about, as this parking gets relocated down here, that maybe some trees here should be included. Oops. So I don't think that we need any further clarification there unless there are questions from commissioners. I think we're okay with that one. Condition 3H, in addition to the 14 bicycle parking spaces that we're proposing for staff and visitors, this condition is asking us to provide at least 24 more bike parking spaces to serve 30% of the 78 independent living units. We're requesting, based on experience, that this condition be removed. In the narrative that I provided few months ago, I think the language there says that the average age of the residents in Bonaventure facilities is 82. More recent data shows that number is actually higher. It's closer to 86. Of the current almost 3,000 Bonaventure residents, there's one that's known to ride a bike. So providing 24 bike parking spaces for these residents is likely, it's just not going to be used. I think that 14 spaces for staff and visitors is going to be probably more than enough. Asking us to put in 24 bike parking spaces for residents that aren't going to use them seems a little unnecessary. So that's our request there. I think that is it. I can scroll back through these if you have questions, or we can just leave it at that. And again, we're here to answer your questions, and we can call up traffic and environmental as we need them.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
I'll start out with the questions this time. Surprise. Just a question about the number of employees that are there on site at particular times, or are there times when more employees are on site? So just describe the kind of employee, coming to the site and shifts, that kind of thing.
Dan can probably speak to this a little bit better. My understanding is that there will be up to 60 full-time employees that work at the facility. They will not all be there at the same time. They do work in shifts. Do you have a sense of kind of most employees on site at any given time?
Probably in the 20 to 22 range,
Okay.
somewhere in there.
Coming and going in shifts throughout the day, obviously, and the night.
Right, because it's a 24-hour facility.
So your heaviest time is going to be probably at lunch, when you would have dining services managers and the most amount of dining staff, in addition to the med aid staff that's there as well. So that lunchtime is probably when we're most staff, and it's going to be 20 in the low 20s.
Okay. Thank you.
Is it customary at a facility of this size to provide transportation services for your residents to shopping destinations? And are you planning on offering transportation services at this facility?
Yes, we will. So we have a bus and a van, and so we'll be taking residents to doctor's appointments, outings, activities. There's a lot of opportunity. We're trying to give them a life that they're used to, that they enjoy. They want to go do stuff. Go on a trip to the coast. Go on a trip into downtown Portland. Do some shopping. Regular doctor visits. So that is something that we do provide.
And then with respect to the bicycle parking, they're requesting to do away with that particular condition. There's been a lot of research over the last decade about more active seniors and, seniors who are more likely to be owning and riding bicycles and generally being active into later age than in prior generations. And so is it your experience that that is not actually materializing in that way, or is it just not getting to your facilities yet?
So with our average age being 86, we're not seeing a lot of bike riders. If we had 100 people move in with bikes, we would accommodate them. But like we've shown, with almost 3,000 residents, we have one. But if Milwaukee was a different type of city and everybody wanted to ride bikes, we would most definitely accommodate our residents with their needs and with their desires.
Thank you.
I have questions.
Yes, I bet you do.
So on the crossing at Kellogg Drive, my question is that if you have 178 people living at your facility and you have a wonderful park that is still on that side of the street and a Milwaukee Senior Center that is on that side of the street, why would you suggest that you cross this? You would have an average of 86-year-olds cross a street.
I assume you're talking about this crossing here?
Yes.
The whole reason for this crossing is because if we were to extend the sidewalk along the north side of Kellogg Creek, we would impact those white oaks.
And do you know how many of those white oaks that you would take out if you did a meandering path?
Oh, man, it was, a meandering path?
Uh-huh.
I don't know that we ever looked at a meandering path. This was like 2 years ago. I seem to recall the number was 7
Okay.
or 9.
And
Trees would be impacted by putting the sidewalk along this side of the road.
And the crossing then gets this down to 0?
The crossing gets it down to 0, yeah.
And then my other question is that there seems to be a lot of green space. Let's see if that's west, that's east. North of the Turning Point Church, have you ever thought about maybe designating that maybe as habitat conservation area and reworking that with some native plants?
I cannot speak to that. I think John Van Stavern from Pacific Habitat could probably talk about it. My understanding is this area is probably not suitable for habitat conservation area because it's been so heavily disturbed in the past. I think they try to keep the habitat conservation the mitigation areas adjacent to the existing HCA, which, I keep losing my cursor, this little area would just sort of be this separate, isolated patch of HCA if you were able to.
But you'd still have a little bit of a corridor up
through
farther
here.
to the north, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure John could come up and probably elaborate on that a little bit. I don't know the details of why, but I do.
I would like, if John does have testimony of a reason either way or not that could not be turned in, I would love to hear it.
Yeah. Well, I'm putting him on the spot. I hope he does.
Come on, John.
Thanks.
John Van Staveren with Pacific Habitat Services, 9450 Southwest Commerce Circle in Wilsonville. You're right, that's an open space. I mean, it's not a place really for habitat where you'd like to have wildlife that could obviously get into the road or something like that. I mean, I haven't spoken to Dan because this just came up obviously tonight. When I look at that area, I would, and we've done this before, that would make a great pollinator habitat. So you'd have plants and shrubs, etc., flowers and whatnot that would actually pollinate bees, hummingbirds, that type of thing. Because it doesn't matter exactly where it is. So you're not encouraging wildlife to go into the road, obviously the aerial. And we've lost a lot of pollinators in our whole world. So, if Dan's up for it, why not?
Could that type of planting be considered mitigation for HCA impacts?
If the planning commission would allow it, sure, yeah.
Okay, and then I have one more question, and thank you for that. And this is not an environmental question. Does Bonaventure have a public art policy, or do they have a tendency to put public art onto their grounds of their facility?
I do not know the answer to that, Dan.
Give me a little more color on that, please.
Statues, fountains, public art. In your square, do you have
We do have some fountains on some of our sites. I am racking my brain for statues.
So the answer is that no, you generally do not have a public art policy.
No.
But I'm assuming on the inside, you generally...
We've got art, a lot of art on the walls,
Right.
in the common areas. There's often a display. It's not uncommon for a resident to be particularly gifted in building wooden toys or sculpture or painting, and we have areas where we would prominently feature art from our residents.
So then that leads me to another question. This kind of lends itself into part of the transportation. We have facilities like Rose Villa here in town and what's the other one? Willamette View. And they have kind of a little plaza area, if you would say, an auditorium with a bar across the street and kind of a restaurant, kind of like a little shopping, living area. Does Bonaventure have something like this where you may expect that you have meeting space or something like that the public may at some point access? Or is that not part of your curriculum?
So we have just recently started adding pub cafes to our buildings that are open to the public. Mostly used by residents. There's a little bowling alley, not quite the full-size 14-pound, 16-pound ball that we'd be using, but a smaller version that our residents like using. And so those areas are open to the public, and you can come in and have a drink or a coffee or enjoy a sandwich. So we have Bonaventure of Salem is on the same site as our home office. So if people want to get together with me for lunch, this just opened up for us a few months ago, and I say, hey, well, meet me next door at Bonaventure, and we can have a pub burger and a coffee, and you can have a drink if you'd like. And so I've started having my meetings rather than go looking for a restaurant in town. I've been having them across the parking lot.
And I don't know if you know the level of detail yet that we see on this site plan, but is there more concentrated parking and visitor parking in those areas?
So if you look at the site on the east side between the building and the church, you're going to have the most amount of parking, 2 banks of parking right there.
Oops.
And that's where a lot of the visitors would be parking.
And then would that be the kind of the same planned area of that building for what you would call the pub eatery and the more of the public access areas?
In this core area here.
Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you.
Yep, and we have dining rooms that you can come in, have lunch or dinner or breakfast.
All right.
Breakfast happens to be one of my 5 favorite meals of the day.
Mine's midnight snack.
Any additional questions for the
I had a
applicant?
couple questions. I think it's somewhere in, as Commissioner Massey said, the 600 pages of material, there was a note about the percent of residents who typically have their own private vehicle and store it on site, and I think it was 30%. Am I correct in recalling that?
Yep, that's an average, and it'll vary by building, vary by age of the building. So
Do you have any kind of permit system or track which residents do have a vehicle on site, or is it just anyone can choose to?
So it's highly uncommon for an assisted living resident to have a car, and memory care, no. So it's primarily the independent residents that have cars, and yeah, they're all, the community staff know which residents have cars. They know where they typically like to park. They'll know if that car is missing, and kind of note that and have that as an additional way of tracking people's coming and goings.
Is there any kind of permitting system or maximum number of vehicles that would be accommodated on a typical Bonaventure facility?
No, not a permitting system per se. It would be we'd find a way to solve that problem if we had 78 independent living residents and they all wanted to have cars. We would address that. But just through the sheer number of projects that we've managed, because we design, we build, and we own and operate all of our own communities. So that would be unusual. We've never come across that.
Okay.
Where we've maxed out the parking.
Gotcha.
Over time, we've seen a slight increase in the parking ratios that we want to have, but not super significant.
Thank you. And the other question I had was about the open space adjacent to the property and just what sort of access you would anticipate granting into the Oak area, and if that's something that would be amenity for the residents, or if that would be available for use, and how you might see maintaining that open space. Just referring to the general.
You're talking
western
about
half of the property.
the big natural area
Yeah.
on the west side?
So the site that we're going to be building is up higher than that natural resource area. So with our home office being next to one of our communities, and my office having a window on the ground floor, I do see residents that want to get their exercise, whether it be with a walker or hand in hand, or the little dog with the chew toy. They have all their favorite walking companions, and so they do like to make that circle around both of our buildings. But off-roading is not a popular activity when you're 86 and one hip's bad and the other one was replaced, and one knee's bad and the other one's been replaced. So it's possible we would have some people that would want to go down in there. I don't know how to comment on that. I don't see 70, 80 residents swarming down there on hot days and playing in the wetlands.
There was the note from North Clackamas Parks, I believe, about the social trail, I think they called it, which is just what I think they're referring to, an informal pathway along the creek that is currently present. And I think North Clackamas had suggested that could become a more formal trail connecting into the park for residents who did want to walk. And I'm kind of just curious if that had entered into your thinking on how the site might connect to the adjacent park next door. Certainly off-roading in a wetland might not be applicable, but a well-graded natural path could be an amenity and also provide that connectivity to the park. Just if you had any thinking along those lines.
If that's something that our residents wanted, as we get out onto the site more and kind of live in it more, and we see that that's what they're doing, we would definitely accommodate that. one of our things that we're always going to be concerned about is safety. So we don't want to create nooks and crannies for people that shouldn't be there to hide out and create a danger for our residents. So that would always be a consideration for us, is the safety of our residents first. But you got a park next door, you got a senior center next door, you got water, you've got fish. Somebody's going to be down there.
Do you know if that social trail is on the south side or the north side of the creek?
On the south side of the creek.
Okay.
And then I'm trying to make this not a leading question, but just what does Bonaventure see it as a amenity asset to continue maintaining and owning the natural space, or do you see that as more of a liability?
No, we would see that as definitely as an asset.
Okay.
It's beautiful. It gives a park-like setting for the residents. I envision people on their decks, kind of sitting on the deck with a nice cup of tea, watching the birds. I definitely see that as amenity, something we would want to keep.
Thank you.
One more question.
Yeah.
So would someone on the team address the topic that I brought up earlier? Is that what actions would you anticipate, if any, based upon the recommendation of Redmond Geotech on the soil and the construction debris?
So we would follow the recommendation of the geotech, which is to strip that down to where the debris is gone and replace the fill so that it's structural. So we would definitely be following our banks would be expecting us to follow the recommendations of the geotech. That's been our standard practice.
So does that get memorialized somehow in a master construction plan or something? I don't know. I'm just asking how that gets,
Well, he's going to be coming out and observing, and we'll have a contract with the geotech. Okay. He'll come out and he'll observe the soil being pulled out and replaced, and I don't know what level of increments. I don't know if he's at 6-inch increments or 9-inch increments, or he's there often making sure that the soil is processed and put back as necessary.
Okay, thank you.
So, and another comment that had been brought up was about going taller as well. Mm-hmm. I know that's a question on some of your minds. Out of 49 communities, we've never gone 5-story. That's a completely different type of construction. I don't have a geotech that supports a 5-story building either. I'm not even positive that going up another story would shrink the footprint that significantly. There are certain constraints. We've got the memory care at the bottom where we have rooms around it, and so that's a completely locked down wing. And they can make a walking trail all the way, interior walking trail all the way around, and that center portion is outside. And so they've got their own little outside area that they can go into, which is secure and safe inside. So that piece isn't going to get smaller. So that one's constrained. The core isn't really going to get smaller by going north, or by going up, by going vertical. And then, so you've got that wing to the north for the independent living. And just based on its configuration, it's not going to come any south. It's just going to go vertical. And with not having a geotech that's certified to go 5-story, with it being highly uncommon in the industry to go 5-story with a completely different construction methodology. 4-story is the typical top end for wood frame construction, the standardized wood frame construction. Going vertical would allow us to add more units, not shrink the footprint significantly.
What about the possibility of understory parking in order to reduce the north side parking impacts and perhaps tighten up the perimeter roadway to reduce encroachment on the HCA? Is understory parking a possibility there?
Not that I'm aware of. Once again, that would push us into the five-story ranges, because we just have to push all that up, and I don't have a geotech that supports a five-story building on this project.
So even the tuck-under style parking?
Digging it down?
Well, no, it'd be like a probably concrete podium, but just head-in parking, not like a parking structure on the ground floor, but it's referred to as tuck-under parking, where you park just underneath the structure.
Yep.
Does that change the construction style in the same manner?
Yeah, that podium is a completely different animal.
Okay.
It also significantly changes the finances of the project, the cost.
Any other questions? Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you so much.
Okay. So we will move on to public testimony. And first, we will start with testimony in support of the application, which we do not have. So we will move to testimony opposed to the application. And I have one, Wallace Brown. If you could come up, please, and state your name and address for the record.
Hello, my name is Wallace Brown. I'm at 5824 Southeast Kellogg Creek Drive, so the corner there of Kellogg Creek and Rusk. And I wasn't sure if I should mark opposed or neutral, and actually now that I can go get a beer and go bowling, maybe I'm a little for. As I was reviewing the information that Brett sent, I was mostly looking at the conditional use application for the senior living, and there was a lot of talk about pedestrian access to things like grocery stores and banks, and this area just happens to be so isolated. Connectivity is very poor. Aside from walking to the park, which has its own challenges with how busy Kellogg Creek Drive can be, and the Milwaukee Center, there's not really very many other places to walk to. The safest route to Safeway is probably along 224. Rusk doesn't have sidewalks. It doesn't have shoulders even, really. It's windy. It's visibility's poor. And walking across to the Rusk on the north side of 224, that section of Rusk also has limited shoulders and sidewalks. There isn't really any mass transit in that area. TriMet does have some service on Lake Road during the weekdays only, not on the weekends. And I walk that area a little bit. I work on International Way, and sometimes I walk to work, and it's not pleasant. So that was mainly my concern, was that it's not an area that is really accessible by much other than by vehicles, motorized vehicles. So that was mainly my opposition.
Great. Thank you. Any questions? Hold on. You guys have any questions? Appreciate you coming and talking tonight. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. So I've got some folks that have indicated they're neutral about the project. Okay. Can you bring that on up? Are you in opposition or neutral, or?
I'm like Wallace. Beer.
Okay. Okay, neutral. So we'll add you in here. So we got 4. We'll start with Dick Shook. Great. If you can state your name and address for the record, please.
I'll do that.
Thank you.
My name is Dick Shook. I live at 4815 Southeast Casa del Rey Road Drive in unincorporated Clackamas County, overlooking the dog run in North Clackamas Park and downstream from this property on the creek. First of all, I want to make a couple comments. The large oak trees on Kellogg Creek Drive have a very significant understory of camas flowers during the spring. They're quite beautiful, and they also extend the back of the Milwaukee Center. Today, I walked the social trail along the creek, scared up a very beautiful pair of hooded mergansers on the creek, but the oak trees that were planted along there by the watershed, North Clackamas Urban Watershed Council years ago, and Chris Runyard back there undertook most of it, is on both sides of the creek, and even runs to the top of the concrete fill. So you can see where the fill ends and goes down to the creek. But anyway, I am a member of the board of directors of the North Clackamas Urban Watershed Council, and the council has spent some time working with the developer and wants to congratulate them on their strong support for height variance for a fourth floor. We appreciate that. We strongly support the request for a parking reduction. They've avoided impact on the mature oak trees. We hope we can do the same for the infant oak trees, although they're probably teenagers by now. And the installation of pervious pavement in the sidewalk and the bike pedestrian connection to Clackamas Park and out to 224. And all of these are appreciated, but they could all be extended to other areas of the construction. We have another member of our board who wants to talk about that, so I'll leave it for now. Any questions?
Any questions?
I have one.
Okay.
The social path,
Yes.
where does it start and where does it kind of end?
Okay, if you know where the firewood shelter is?
Yes.
If you walk north of that corner back there used to be picnic area B, but it's now a wildflower area with camas and avalanche lilies. And you go back to the northeast corner, there's a trail that takes off. There's a new tree that's fallen there.
Does that trail go all the way to 224?
It does. I walked all but about 100 yards of it.
And noticing your young age,
Yes.
and you still like to get out there and walk on that path. Is the social path, is it easily walkable?
Well, right now it's pretty wet and muddy, and there's a lot of teasel out there right now that's overgrown. Makes it a little bit hard to get through. And actually, the social trail, if it was developed, would have to move back from the creek. It's impinging on the creek now.
Oh, and so would you see it as a benefit to the residents of Bonaventure to have a more formal of a path that would get you to the senior center on the north side than?
I think that would be beneficial, particularly if they could keep it back above the creek and not get within the 50-foot or 75-foot riparian area.
Okay.
But I think, yeah, that'd be a pleasant walk back there. I think what we get there now is some transient movement back and forth, but not serious. Just occasional.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Neil Schulman.
Hi, I'm Neil Schulman. I'm the Executive Director of the North Clackamas Watersheds Council. Our office is at 2416 Southeast Lake Road. And as Dick, as one of our board members, mentioned, we've spent a fair amount of time with the folks at Bonaventure over the last couple of months and appreciate their willingness to improve the proposal and its creek friendliness and watershed friendliness throughout this process. There's several things we support. There's a couple of areas we do think can be improved. We submitted some more lengthy, detailed comments. I'm just going to really hit the highlights and also just respond to a couple of things that were discussed today. First and foremost, and I think the broader picture that I think is critical is to look, as a watershed council, we look at the entire watershed and not just site by site. And the Kellogg-Mount Scott Creek watershed is 47% impervious. If you look at watershed management science, when you get to 45% is when you start to see significant impairment of water quality and increased flooding, which we've all heard about. And the further you get above that, the harder and more expensive it gets to bring it back. So we have a relatively narrow window to bring that percent of impervious surface down 2% before it becomes really, really difficult and really expensive. And so while this proposal does have a lot of improvements, I think I just want to really highlight the importance of maintaining infiltration and as much pervious surface as possible, and that we actually need to be moving the other direction on a watershed-wide basis. That being said, the way this property is zoned, we definitely support the height variance. That does shrink the footprint, and again, that is critical both on this site because of its proximity to the park and the creek and salmon habitat, but also because of that larger picture. The parking reduction we definitely support. We actually think it could be realigned and reduced further. I have not heard any discussion throughout this process about sharing parking with the church, which has an obviously very large parking lot that is mostly used on Sundays. In the conversation that we heard today about the kind of corner north of the church parking lot to the right of where that red stormwater facility is, and maybe like this area, if I can get the mouse over here, one of the conversations that we've had would be, because of the proximity of this area to the creek, what about shifting some of that parking into this area, because it is fill and it is grass and it could be pollinator habitat, but it's really the creek habitat and the buffers around the creek that is ecologically by far the most valuable. That is the other thing that I would say is, yes, we definitely support the avoidance of impact to the mature oaks. The council back in 2011, 2012 did do a large planting of trees, including oaks, and those were the ones that Dick was referencing. And we would hope that this project would avoid that, avoid basically undoing that investment to the extent that possible at all. But I think the other opportunity that we'd like to raise is that the HCA area with the mature oaks in this neck of the woods, literally, is a really ecologically valuable site. We believe it deserves permanent protection and is not developable or suitable for development at any rate. And we would like to see some form of permanent protection, whether it becomes part of the park district or eventually gets transferred to a land trust, whether it's the Nature Conservancy or whoever, so that it can be managed for its ecological value and we don't have to worry about it being impacted in the future. Again, we support the pervious pavement. We support any future reduction of parking because of cars that leak oil and brake fluid and all of those things are usually a more significant impact on water quality than building size. So any opportunity to reduce that, move it back from the creek, I think should be taken. we definitely support the trail connection that Dick referenced, again, bringing it back from the creek, but also recognizing that we are going to have more people living in Milwaukee in the future, and in the grand scheme of things, to preserve the possibility of a connection between North Clackamas Park and Three Creeks Natural Area, and a, kind of more kind of future vision of a interconnected trail system is something to keep in mind as well. That is basically the part of our, the core of our comments. The other thing I would add, and that was referenced earlier, is the inaccuracy and lack of confidence in FEMA's floodplain maps. We've definitely seen that before. And again, the more impervious surface we add, the more flood risk we are potentially creating for anything downstream. So I think being conservative about that makes a lot of sense, but from a human property standpoint, as well as from an ecological standpoint. And I don't know if consultation has gone on with the Department of Geology and Mineral Industries, Dogami et al. In this process, but I think that is a place where we know that especially as we see increased flashiness with climate change and higher peak flows, that those floodplain management issues are hard to parse, and we need to be conservative about that. So again, we'd like to thank all the energy that has gone on to continually improving this proposal. We appreciate Bonaventure's time working with us and look forward to continuing to do so.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Could you describe what you mean by flashiness for the benefit of those of us who may not be well-versed in stormwater?
Sure. So when we get rain, basically, water will obviously run down into creeks. The more impervious surface we have, the faster and more of it ends up running off of rooftops, parking lots, whatever, into the creek, and then the creek becomes really high for a while and then goes back down. In a natural watershed, it infiltrates into the soil. It moves very slowly into the creek. You have lots of water, often all summer long, because it percolates through the soil, which also cleans some of the pollutants out of it. So as you pave more of a watershed, you get a much more spiky flow. It gets high, and then it gets low, and then it gets super high really quickly, and then it gets lower. In addition to the added factors from impervious surface, and that impervious surface could be, up in Happy Valley at the headwaters of Mount Scott Creek, as well as here. It also, climate change is giving us basically, you don't need me to tell you this, hotter, drier summers, and more kind of big stormy events, and that is also increasing the flashiness. So we are kind of set up between the development and climate change and the associated weather patterns for a little bit of a double whammy, between where the floods will be bigger and the droughts will be droughtier, and obviously where we develop has to be, that has to be considered.
Thank you for that
I have a question for Ms. Shulman, too. So we talked about the maybe looking at parking at the north of the Turning Point Church, where the suggested pollination area, for better lack. That bioswale that is there, that is on that corner, that is now proposed to move south.
This one?
Yes, and so to be able to include that parking, you would expect that bioswale to remain as originally drawn. Would you much rather see impervious surface, I guess, and parking lot up there to the north, or the movement of that bioswale?
I think that I would need to know a little bit more, and I think maybe the folks from Bonaventure can kind of answer this about the amount of stormwater facilities needed to treat the area, and whether or not obviously the less impervious surface you have, and then maybe the less parking you have, the fewer stormwater facilities you may need. But there is a calculation for that, and they're going to be the ones who know it. I think my main interest there, and there may be other possible alignments I'm not thinking of, but the main interest there is to maximize the buffer possible in this area along the riparian area that is the critical habit. Not only is it critical for the water quality of the creek, but it's also critical for all kinds of terrestrial animals that tend to migrate along creeks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Bob Bohannon.
Hi, thank you. I'm Bob Bohannon. I live at 13732 Southeast Laurie, and that's in Oak Grove. And I also am a member of the North Clackamas Urban Watersheds Council, and I'm a member of the Oak Grove Community Council as well, and I'm their representative to the Watershed Council. And I think even though we haven't taken the second development up in our Luart with the CPO, the previous one where they're going to build townhomes, we were pretty much lockstep with the Watershed Council, worked together quite a bit. I think that if we do take it up, they're going to be right along the same lines. And I don't know what else I can add that Neil and Dick didn't provide, because they've pretty well covered it. And Dick's the expert. He lives right there in the neighborhood, has been there forever. And this is something we've worked on quite a bit. And the biggest thing is we've been happy that Bonaventure's been open to suggestions, has tweaked a few things, definitely listening to the community, listening to us, and trying to come to some kind of a terms with a quality project that fits within the neighborhood, fits within the environment, and not just going willy-nilly, let's just level the place and go like hell. So we appreciate that. And yeah, we're not 100% on board, but I think that we've seen a lot of change, and I think at this point we're fairly positive that there's something can get figured out, and get a few easements and a few variances, and I think it's all good at this point.
Okay.
Any questions?
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks.
Chris Runyard.
Good evening. Thank you. Chris Runyard, Northeast Portland. The reason I'm here is because since 1995, with Dick Shook, I've been planting trees in this watershed and trying to restore the salmon habitat for Mascot, Kellogg Creek, all the tributaries. So much that I started a business doing just that. And so I planted most of the reaches of this watershed. And this project, I appreciate people working with everyone, but in the end, we're building stuff on fill that was filled in a wetland, and then we're all going to complain about the flooding. And so someday we got to stop doing all this. I don't know if it'll be this time or not, but the people upstream that flood and getting bought out by FEMA, people downstream who will flood, the sheet flow of water that goes over North Clackamas Park during the big rains, all through the dog run area. You got a huge problem with water, and this isn't helping no matter how many ponds, swales, whatever they put into it. So as a watershed guy, I can't sit and not say that. So let's get to this specific thing. So the path through, there's a couple things that came up. One was a path on the sidewalk that goes into the park on the north side of Kellogg Creek Drive. Like Dick Shook said, not only is it an oak forest there's a camas wetland under most of that. It's really hard to get a path through there. It's a sidewalk. We already tried it. We tried it with the Brownstone people, and we all met out there. The camas is awesome out there, and it's really rare. So don't destroy that with a sidewalk that goes through that oak forest, please. As far as trading a HCA for pollinator habitat, you can make pollinator habitat anywhere, and pollinator habitat is awesome. But really, it's a bunch of flowering, pollinating plants, and you can do that in the parking lots and landscapes that are going in. I would never trade riparian habitat for a pollinator field. Like, that's kind of ecologically, that's kind of a silly trade. Natural area access, just like what Dick was saying, I hope whoever lives in that area has access. They should. It's awesome there. I'm not really in favor of paved trails, but you could do something where I think people would be able to access it. And like Dick was saying, on a little bit different path than what's there now, because that's too close to the creek for that kind of thing. The natural area, I think you were asking about if it's an asset or liability. I kind of think you two are talking about different things. I think it's definitely an asset, but if I owned it, it's a huge liability unless I was really good at managing natural areas. In my experience, I've seen them managed poorly, mostly. It's really hard to manage them because people want to set up their tents in there. People want to do all sorts of things. So there's got to be constant attention. And it's not just the area between the buildings where that would be in the park, but it's also north of the creek, which is the whole area that goes up to the slope that goes up to the land trust housing north of that. So there's a lot to think about there. And ideally it would go into public ownership or some sort of protected ownership with someone who manages that as a natural area, make sure people aren't living in there, make sure it's not trashed, make sure they could do good trail work and keep the weeds down and all that kind of stuff. And then last, then I'll be on my way, is all the erosion control. What I typically see is a lot of plastic netting all over these things, and acres of plastic netting or plastic wattles. There is biodegradable erosion control. I'm hoping that's one of the stipulations about building here. It'd be really disheartening to see any of the slopes covered with the plastic netting with either the coir fabric or the jute mixed in with it. So I do see that a lot. I don't know why, but that seems to be kind of standard. So anyways, that's all I have.
Any questions for Chris?
On the erosion control, are you referring to like during construction erosion control or permanent installations that would be present post-construction?
Both. So what I see is when builders grade land, they'll put something on it, and a lot of times that something on it is a plastic netting with natural fibers in it. So when you come back in 5 years, the natural fibers are gone, they've done their work, but the netting that held that together is still there. It's and they plant seed through it, so it's all in the grass. So if you took a shovel and dug in, you could start pulling out the netting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. Thank you.
Thank you for the testimony tonight. Does any member of the Planning Commission have any questions regarding the testimony to this point? Oh, I'm sorry. Do you have a yellow card? No,
I came in late, so
Okay. We're going to have to, we can't hear you without a microphone, so Brett, I think, is going to get you a form.
Why don't you go ahead and have her come up?
Yeah, you can just come on up. Come on up, and we can fill that out after if you want, just so we have a record of it. But if you could state your name and address for the record.
Yes, my name is Joy Lescraft. I live at 13312 Southeast Rusk Road, which is the corner of Rusk Cliff and Rusk Road. So I am a neighbor. I'm not a professional person, so bear with me, please. This is a very emotional thing for my neighborhood, because I've gone through the previous one. I've gone through several changes in this neighborhood over the 17 years that I have lived on that corner. I've seen many changes. Any project that would go on this property is of a real concern to me, because I live here. I'm 70 years old, so I intend to die here. I was married in North Clackamas Park, so I'm very familiar with the neighborhood, and I love it. And I've objected to a lot of the improvements, so-called improvements, mostly changes. My real concern about this is, and the gentleman that was just here brought up something that I was not aware of, but yet I've seen it often. And when he talks about this netting and stuff that goes over I saw it up where you come off 205 onto 224 when they made all those pits in there and put the drains in for drainage and that sort of thing. And I've seen it put there too. But what people don't realize about this area up here that they're talking about is right on the corner of Rusk Road and 224 that is now green space. I guess they call it green space for lack of another word that I would know. Geese come in there all the time. And I know that anybody that has driven down 224 sees the mass settlements of geese. They are across the street at the insurance person's area, where that area is when the water is in there. They have their young in there. It's lovely to watch. Well, now they have decided to take over that corner. So, of course, what they're doing is they're coming across 224 and causing their own traffic stop. And they come over there, and if you were to put that kind of netting, which I never thought about before because I'm not a professional, they could get their heads trapped in there just like any other bird that you see, seagulls coming from the ocean or whatever else. We've got a real problem with plastic. And Oregon has been a real entrepreneur as far as bottle control and taking away the opportunities for wildlife to be destroyed. I looked out the other day and there was a deer in my front yard. Now, because of the geese and stuff like that, I've had to put a wall around my property, and we're now fencing or gating my property because I don't know if you're aware of it or not, but there is a recovery home right next to my home. I'm sure you know about it. They use the parking lot they rented from the church, so there is parking there every day. There are 2 churches that are using that facility there, one on Saturday and one on Sunday, and they both seem to have a large population on Wednesday nights. So there is more parking that is being taken up there now than a lot of people know about. I see it because I'm right there. I look out my kitchen window and I see a 25-mile speed limit that comes around from Kellogg to Rusk Road that is now being race car speeds that come through there. With the development of the 82nd Drive traffic rearrangement, people use Webster and Rusk Road for a lot of traffic that we didn't used to have. And it's all times of the night. I can hear people racing their cars. Now, I realize if you're 86 years old, your bedtime is probably 8 or 8:30, and you're not going to be out there on a skateboard or a bicycle getting hit by those cars. But traffic is a severe problem there. We've discussed it before, and I know that the people that you're dealing with have looked into this and they've come up with some alternatives. I don't see how, with the people that come in and out of Kellogg Road or Kellogg Drive, could handle a bike path through there. The entrance to the Turning Point Church from Rusk Road, it's clearly marked that it's an entrance only. However, there are a lot of people late at night that come out through there, and they come out at fast speeds. I also noticed that when someone is pulled over off of Rusk Road or off of 224, they come into the church parking lot to do their ticketing and that sort of thing. And then if the police officer gets a call while he's there, he races out that entrance. I also see the fire trucks and the ambulances and stuff that go to, is it Deer Park? I don't know the name of the adult home across the street from here, but they come in all times of the day or night, so that's 2 vehicles. It's an ambulance and it's a fire truck. And then you have your 80 buses that come in and out 4 times a day from the school barn that's Rusk. So I know you're aware of the traffic problems there. If an ambulance was to come into your facility that you're suggesting, they might have to wait. They might not be able to get onto Kellogg because of the traffic issues that are there. Now, maybe you could put a stop sign right there or a flashing light or whatever. There are alternatives, and I'm open to that. But this is something that the neighborhood, I'm not against this thing. I think it's a better use than what they had planned before. But still, with people of this age, you're going to have health issues and you're going to have vehicles that come and go. And like they say, there is a TriMet bus that goes in there, I think once or twice a day, that take people to Lake Road and to where that's the only place you can get a bus. I don't think there's any bus stops on Thiessen or Aldercrest, but there might be, and I just am not aware of it. But again, it's a situation where we're all concerned. The wildlife that comes into our property, the return of wildlife that hasn't been there for years has been wonderful to live at. And I just thank you for the opportunity of letting me speak from a neighbor that has lived here many years, that loves this community, and I'm sorry to see that more aren't here from the community, but then when you only send out 4 or 5 letters because we're 500 feet from the church, I think you would see that we'd all have concerns about our children and habitat and the flooding that has changed much more. If you go to the house behind me, you'll find that they flood every year. They've built, a flood barrier so that they don't flood in their house. And like I say, I just appreciate you hearing me.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for coming. Any questions? No? Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Does any member of the Planning Commission have any questions regarding the testimony to this point? No?
I have questions for city staff, but I'm assuming they get a chance to come up and rebut, right?
We are going to offer the applicant a rebuttal to the comments. And then we can ask the staff.
Okay.
Does that work? The applicant, would you like to come up and provide any additional comments in response to the testimony?
I think we would. Is there any chance we could do like a 5-minute break?
Let's do another 5-minute break.
Thank you.
No, it's okay.
Glad they did. Little rough.
Okay, thank you very much. We're ready to,
Where active parent? I'm not worried about nothing.
we are ready to allow time for the applicant for rebuttal or additional comments that they would like to make in response to the public testimony.
Great, thank you. Just a couple of kind of points of clarification. There's been some discussion about the social trail along Mount Scott Creek. I just want to highlight the fact that any sort of formalized trail along the south side of the creek would represent an HCA impact. There are some standards, and maybe Brett can speak to this a little bit more because I don't have the natural resource section of the code, but certain amount of trail is allowed within the HCA. I want to say it can be no more than 30 inches wide, and it has to be soft surface. Does that sound about right? Yeah. So just wanted to point that out. There's been some discussion of potentially shifting some parking over to this area north of the church. One of the things that's a really important consideration when Bonaventure is sort of laying out a site and designing a site is that there needs to be really quick and convenient access for residents to get from parking to the building. And so a lot of the site is designed so that to minimize the distances between parking and the resident entrances. So just wanted to point that out as well. There's been some discussion about management of this natural resource area that's basically the entire western part of the site. We just got those comments from North Clackamas Parks and Rec today about wanting to have some discussions with Bonaventure about potentially the social trail. And I don't remember if their comments talked about management of the white oaks or not. So just wanted to point out that that's Bonaventure's happy and willing to have conversations with the Park District about, potential options for management of pieces of the land. I don't know that we have any details, but Bonaventure is willing to have those conversations, and hopefully, that can happen soon. I don't know where Parks kind of left things, if they're planning on getting in contact with Bonaventure, but just want to note that that conversation can happen.
Okay.
Yeah. I think that's it. Any other questions for us?
I have a question. So what about pursuing opportunities for using the church parking lot?
I don't know that those conversations have happened. I certainly haven't been in touch with the church about the possibility of shared parking. I know that it would not work for the residents.
Right.
Because it's too far away.
But staff potentially.
For employee parking, I think there might be some concern about kind of having overlap for peak parking times. When the church's parking lot is full, and my understanding is it does get full on occasion, that there may be not good, there might be too much overlap, basically. But I don't know that those conversations have formally taken place with the church. No.
Okay. Yeah. Any other questions for the applicant?
I think that your comments about ease of parking is certainly well taken. But something along the same lines is that if the parking could be,
Can you move the mic?
Sorry, if the parking could be extended, to the east somewhat, and everyone likes to have convenient parking, but could that be a staff parking area?
I think, maybe Dan can speak to this a little bit more, but most of the parking is designed to provide good access for residents to the primary building entrances so that, the independent living residents will have the best access to that portion of the building and so on. I assume, and maybe Dan can speak to a little more detail, but I assume that the employee and visitor parking is kind of intended to be this area here, which is obviously the furthest away from the building entrances. So those, I think, employees are sort of guided towards the areas that are furthest away from the building entrances.
Understood.
And yeah.
We'd envision the parking on the north to be almost exclusively for residents.
Up here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so we carved off 10 of those that were requested, and we're asking to leave the other 10 for our residents who are, 86 years old and would have a considerable hike. If we move that parking to the east on the other side of the road, they could have a considerable hike to their rooms, and then when they get settled, they got to have another hike to get to breakfast, lunch, or dinner if they're going to choose to do it.
Thank you.
So if I may. So how many parking spots do you estimate that you need?
139.
And with the elimination of the 10 right there, how many parking spots are we currently talking?
We didn't eliminate them, we moved them.
With the moving, how many parking spots are we now talking?
We're talking about moving 10 from the north to the southwest.
And we're still at that number?
We're still at 139.
Yeah.
Still at 139. And my other question is that since you're, what about, could you move those other, is there enough space as you have parking on the east side? Am I saying that right? The east side? Could you put that parking over there on the west side that is outside of the habitat conservation area? In that little arm?
Where are we talking?
Up north at the older residence hall to the west. At the entrance of the building, or what I would call maybe another entrance of the building, to the south now.
Here?
To the south, yeah.
We have parking there.
More to the front of the building on the west, on the west.
Keep going west.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm
West
not
and then
following.
south?
Oh. So you're saying shift some of this?
I'm just wondering if that is a possible area of parking, is that an entrance to the building as well, as you do have on the east side?
Off the top of my head, I don't remember.
Okay. And I want to ask on this social trail, since it is to the north and that would be where your residents are living there as housing units, would they be able to walk on a pervious path to get to the senior center that way?
A 30-inch soft surface trail?
Yes.
Some would be able to, some would not be able to.
Wouldn't you find that a lot safer than having those people walk through a parking lot and a roadway and across a road to get to the senior center from a safety standpoint? Since your memory care people, I'm assuming, are not going to be the ones that will be walking on their own.
Correct.
And that even the middle building ones that are in at least some need of care, that your residential housing, which is to the north, don't you find it from a safety issue to be able to get to the senior center, to find a path to the north, than having them walk through the parking lot and through a rotunded street and then across another busy street called Kellogg?
I would have to say there's risks going both ways. So a lot of that would depend on what the residents feel comfortable with. Depend on how uneven the trail is to the north. Some people might prefer to take the risks on the pavement to the south with their walking. And there's going to be some people that are going to much prefer nature, whether there's a trail there or not, and kind of blaze their own path and walk that way if they're more nature-minded.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Anything, okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So I'm looking over the parking modification request, and there was some information provided about the Bonaventure of Vancouver location. And it looks to me like you were ending up requesting a 0.78 ratio per units.
Bonaventure, Vancouver.
Yeah, and but your parking utilization rate never exceeds 58%. I'm just trying to make sure I understand. And this is the parking demand and capacity summary of Bonaventure of Clark County. And the number of occupied spaces never exceeds 58%.
So those assumptions are going to be standardized based on on historical numbers, you're never going to be able to guess how many residents, one, are going to be having cars, and two, what the, how many family members are going to be wanting to come. And so those are going to be two driving factors in parking. And we'd hate to be underparked and then have lots of family members come. And I suppose there's a risk that in Milwaukee, nobody wants to drive, they all want to have bikes, and none of their families come to visit them, and then we'd be well overparked. But it's just kind of it's going to go community by community based on how many people are going to be parking there in terms of residents and in terms of family.
Which I think it's why it's useful to look at all of the facilities that are listed on that exhibit, because some of them are overparked, some of them are underparked.
Yep.
Got to use averages. It's your best information.
No, recently, in the last couple of years, we've opened a project in Gresham, and they're underparked, and we're having to look for parking solutions.
What's the ratio there?
I don't know off the top of my head.
So 0.78 just seems, I guess, kind of high compared to lots of your other properties. And so I'm just wondering if there's opportunity to, bring that down further, especially since we're looking at encroachment, in the, still looking at encroachment in the HCA with some of the parking spaces. So is there, you offered a range that you were recommending, and it looks to me like the low end of the range was close to 0.7.
Which we would be concerned that would, especially with our recent experiences in Gresham, that would be getting too close to the underpark range, and then the solution's going to end up being staff parking on the street.
Commissioner Edge, just to answer your question, the rate that they have for Gresham is 0.67.
Okay.
In their table.
So if we went from 139 to 129, that would be in around the 0.75 range. And that would eliminate those 10 spaces right at those northerly 10 spaces that remain.
Rather than move them.
Correct. Well, there's moving the ones from this to the southwest, but then there's the other bank of 10 just to the east.
Correct.
And that, is the same encroachment as the ones that we've proposed to move. And that sounds to me like the elimination of those 10 would still keep you within an acceptable range per your standard at your other properties.
Those 10 spaces are intended to specifically serve the independent living residents, though, so eliminating them or moving them takes that away from those residents.
So
it's not just
move those as opposed to lose them. Because some of this is based on the configuration of this particular site and the way that the parking is adjacent to the independent living wing of the building.
So I guess how many parking spaces do we have across the north face of that wing, of the independent living wing?
Give that number, Scott.
I could pull up the site plan.
2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Count 32.
8.
Adjacent to the building.
That's 24. That's 32. 42.
42?
And that's not counting to the west. That's probably another 10 spots. So
32 plus 10, so 32 against the building and then 10.
And then there's to the east, I'm directionally challenged. North of the church parking lot, there's another 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, another 8 slots to that entrance to the west.
So we're up to 40 that are on, without having to cross the internal roadway.
Yes.
32
Yes.
across the north face, and
So
then
32 here
8.
and 8 here?
Yes.
And so 40 gets us up to that 0.5 ratio for the independent living that you cited.
But it would be residents and family members.
But there's plenty more parking. I mean, and, through the rest of the facility. I mean.
Yeah, I know, I think if you have a specific question, let's ask it, and then we're going to move on.
Well, I'm trying to prod whether it's, whether they're willing to consider removing that parking, because we're looking at numbers to say, I'm looking at their numbers to offer an explanation why they might be willing to lose that parking, and I'm prodding them to see if they are or not.
Okay.
That is the question.
Can you answer the question?
We'd prefer not to lose that parking.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions about the parking? Did we satisfy that? Okay. Anything else for the applicant before we move on? Clarifying? Okay.
Great. Thanks.
All right, thank you. All right. So we have an opportunity to ask staff some clarifying questions as well. I know you're very eager. Why don't you start us off with that?
My first question is that do we have a requirement for public art? We have a requirement for public art in multifamily, don't we?
I don't think it's a requirement for public art. I'd have to look.
Okay, so while you're looking that, I'll have some other ones. And so is there anything that is in the code to be able to protect the remaining HCA on this land and the floodplain from turning it into a lawn? What's to stop them once they own the property and we let that they just don't get a lawnmower and just mow it all down?
Okay. Let me go back to your first question just real quickly to scratch it off, because when I look in the guidelines and standards for multifamily design, there's no public art requirement. I don't know if you're thinking about something else, just maybe something downtown.
Oh, yeah, like how did we get Actual Tree to put art? Did they just volunteer?
Well, they're downtown. I mean, so a downtown development
design.
might have.
Thank you. Okay, all right.
So to the HCA question, when an area has an HCA designation, the code has a list of activities that are exempt from any review. So some kind of like minor allowances, for example, 150 square feet of disturbance for like an outdoor play area or a garden or something like that. There are limits on and rules about tree removal, for example, in an HCA area. So there's some allowances for removing some trees, a certain number in a year. If you're trying to remove a nuisance species tree, there's, kind of more of an allowance for that, but there's some limits on those kinds of activities. So for someone to have an HCA designation on their property and try to remove all the vegetation or just make it into a lawn, I don't think the code would let them do that, at least not very easily. Certainly not as an exempt kind of activity.
Okay. And can you answer the question about what can be built as a path into a floodplain? Is that the correct rule? 30 inches? Is it 30 inches or wider? Is it up to 30 inches?
I'll tell you what's allowed as an exempt activity.
Okay.
And then someone could propose to do something more than that, but it would go through some kind of natural resource review. Not necessarily to the Planning Commission maybe, but it would need some kind of a city review. So the limitation is, and for the creek side, we're not talking just about HCA. Now we're talking about water quality resource area, which is in some respects more protected than HCA. There are fewer allowances for disturbance in a water quality resource area. So I'm looking at the exempt part of the Natural Resource Code that affects both HCA and water quality resource area, and the limit is no wider than 30 inches. If there are stairs, the stair width is limited to no more than 50 inches, and then there's a trail grade limitation of 20%. It's supposed to be unpaved and constructed with non-hazardous pervious materials. Should be at least 15 feet away from the top of bank of the water bodies. And adjacent plants can be trimmed, but clearances are not to exceed a height of 8 feet and a width of 6 feet. And you're not supposed to remove native trees larger than 6-inch diameter, or native shrubs or conifers larger than 5 feet tall. in the trail areas, or to make trails.
Can you help me explain this 8-foot, 6-foot barrier? In other words, you can have a grassy knoll next to your path. Is that what I'm understanding? A grass area next to your path?
You can, as I am reading it, I think you can clear vegetation up to a height of 8 feet above the trail. So
Oh, okay. I was thinking width-wise.
And then there's a width up to 6 feet. So plants adjacent to trails, width of 6 feet. And my first reading would be maybe that's on each side, which would start to be a pretty wide corridor, but it's also called trimming, not removal. So.
Okay, all right.
Could maybe have a little discussion about, I don't think that means you should be pulling all the vegetation out, but I think the idea is to allow access. You can trim the plants, but not remove the plants.
So if you're in what are the rules for the habitat conservation area on a path?
So now, if I'm moving.
I was just going to say, just to clarify, those were for the natural resources, and those are exemptions from both the.
Those are for both.
Both the HCA. So these are dealing with natural resources and not with the floodplain. There is large overlap, obviously, between the two. But I think the way that you would phrase your question was specifically about within the floodplains. Brett's response was actually for within natural resources.
That's perfect. That's really what I needed to know.
And so I was speaking also to where we're talking about this particular trail, it is within a water quality resource area and HCA, but the water quality resource area kind of wins in being more protective. If you are trying to do a trail farther away from the creek, and now we're just in an HCA, not to diminish the HCA, but now there's no water quality resource designation. There are some additional exemptions for disturbance, but none that are particular to. Oh, so yeah, there is an allowance for trails, low-impact recreational facilities, including trails, no more than 500 square feet of new impervious surface. Any trail should have a maximum width of 5 feet and be constructed using non-hazardous pervious materials. So.
Oh, it's still non-hazardous impervious materials. So no tar and no concrete.
Right.
Does pervious concrete count as a non-hazardous in the city's eye?
Probably. I don't know. We might defer to engineering or,
Okay.
No. Yeah.
I just wanted to get the rules straight. Thank you. I'm done.
Okay. Anything else for staff at this point? Any clarifying?
I'm still curious about how we're supposed to determine the smallest reduction needed language in 19605 for the vehicle parking.
Right. We can try to speak between David and I, can speak to that. And then is there it's not necessarily staff rebuttal, but do we get to respond to a couple things that we've heard as well? I don't know if that seems to, maybe the last time or two has gotten lost a little bit. That I appreciate being able to take questions, but I was hoping we might have a chance just to respond to a couple of things that got mentioned.
It's not in the script, but.
I'll ask you that question.
Yeah, can we do it as a question to staff?
Let's ask him a question. Yeah, how would you rebut?
Well, this was one of the things, was we had noted we needed to come back to this question of parking modification, and maybe I'll say a little something and then get out of the way and let David answer it. So one answer is the code is unsurprisingly not 100% clear on this question. It does mention, let me just go here for a second. For one, it sometimes kind of lumps together a determination and a modification, which are two different things. So it talks a little bit about what should be in an application for a determination of ratios, which is kind of the way the code's written, seems to kind of include the modification request as well, including you're supposed to propose a minimum and maximum parking ratio as part of your application, which the applicant has done. But with respect to the criteria for approval, you're demonstrating that it's reasonable, and in particular for modifications where you're wanting to decrease the amount of minimum parking, it does come down to the piece that you mentioned, which is the requested reduction is the smallest reduction needed based on the specific circumstances. So that would seem to suggest that at the end of the day, for a particular project, you're asking the applicant to kind of get to a number, which in this case, they proposed a specific number. It happens to be within the original range that they proposed as part of the modification. So And in this case, because of where the code is coming from, absent natural resource impacts, it's saying, hey, the code says this is what you're supposed to provide for parking. If you want to go below the minimum, make the case that what you're proposing is the least below the minimum that you need to do. In this context, interestingly, there's some interest in, wanting to maybe go as far as possible below the minimum rather than just showing that's the barest minimum. But you could, I suppose, factor your discussion of the import of reducing impacts to the natural resource area as we're trying to find the least reduction.
Right, and so the code is geared towards provide the maximum amount possible that's below the minimum that you can reasonably fit.
Right.
Well, I think that also meets their demand. And so what we've heard in looking at their parking assessment memo for the proposal over in Vancouver that they used, they threw out a lot of numbers in that. They looked at a lot of their different sites. They've stated that the 0.67 at Gresham they feel is too low. They then provided, they kind of looked at 0.7. They ultimately came up to that 0.78 number. That 0.78 number on this site would be 133 spaces. So at 139 spaces, they're more at like 0.82. And ultimately, when you're requesting a modification, as opposed to when you're doing a determination where the uses aren't in the table, you need to provide for that range. They provided that range, which I think created a lot of confusion. They didn't need to do that. They could have ultimately just come and said, we think that 139 spaces is the absolute minimum that we need to provide. And I would have the applicant correct me if that's wrong, but I believe that that's what they're saying, is that 139 spaces is the minimum that we need. That's still below the minimum requirement. When you look at all the different individual uses, it's less than what they would be required, and that's why the modification is needed. So they can get to that specific number of 139. Whether or not, the Planning Commission can kind of push back on that and say, based on your parking assessment, we think that you can get lower than that. It gets a little bit squishier because ultimately it's being driven by the applicant. But I think that that's something that can be discussed.
Thank you.
Can I
Do you have any
respond?
additional rebuttals?
Thanks for that question. Thanks for that question for staff. Just a couple things, and I don't know that they're necessarily a rebuttal. I just wanted to speak to a couple questions that came up. One, Commissioner Hemer had asked about the idea of establishing kind of a pollinator area or something like that, and the code, when it talks about mitigation for disturbance to a natural resource, the first push for mitigation areas somewhere else within the natural resource area. And the code says, but you can go outside of those areas to do mitigation. You just need to provide some kind of protection, like a restriction or something like that, so that if a pollinator area is established, it's not going to become HCA by itself, because if one reviewed the methodology for what defines an HCA, it relates to a lot of other things like proximity to a water feature, floodplain location, that kind of thing. So, for example, the farther you get away from a water quality resource feature, the less likely is that you're going to be able to be considered an HCA, as I understand it. That said, there is a connection to there's a spatial connection to the riparian corridor, and so if you want to require something like a pollinator area, I think you'd want to be clear about, the code requirement is that there would need to be some extension of permanent protection for that area, since it's not going to be considered HCA on our map, but it's been allowed to be a mitigation area if that was the direction. So that was just a point about what the code says about that. Also, just to Commissioner Hemer's question about public art and kind of the public meeting space, I just wanted to be clear that my understanding was that the applicant was describing some features that, like the pub, restaurant thing, bowling alley open to the public, are at some of their other facilities. It wasn't my understanding that that's proposed for this facility, and that I think you should think about that, maybe making the facility a little bit different. I mean, what we've been thinking about or considering here is this proposal is, amenities and facilities provided for the residents. And if you introduce a more open to the public restaurant kind of feature, that I think it would be fair, would seem maybe to be reasonable to consider that that's going to bring more traffic to the site. And I don't know, the traffic impact study really looked at that. So just a point of clarification. I think if there was an example of what might evolve or what could happen, and some of those changes would actually need additional review because it's different from what's being approved as the conditional use or community service use. So just a point there. And then another question about, there've been some questions about the natural resource area as kind of an amenity for residents and what kind of access there might be. And I guess I just wanted to point out that one of the things that I believe we've captured it in the conditions and that came through the ESA report was actually to require some signage around the western and northern portion of the perimeter loop to say, don't go into this area. This is a natural area. So I realize there's obviously some maybe natural tension or conflict about having these natural areas and wanting people to be able to enjoy them, but also to some degree wanting to control, I guess, or limit disturbance. We're trying to restore these areas. And so that is a condition, I think that we've included in the recommendations is to, as per ESA's review, to just kind of have some signage that would discourage that kind of use. If there was a decision to establish some kind of a formal trail, that's obviously a little bit different. You're directing people to that area. But in general, I think we wanted to discourage people from just walking down into the natural area. And then just two final points. We did, in the conditions, the recommended conditions, it's actually in condition 1C with respect to the requirements for the construction management plan. In response to the comment that we received from the Watershed Council, we did add a sentence at the end saying that all erosion control materials shall be specified to be biodegradable. I'm not an erosion control expert. I don't know if the way that's written, that would extend to, there was a question about permanent erosion control in terms of what's laid down as part of site recovery. So I don't know if another phrase is needed there, but it's certainly, at least the way I understand it to be written, would capture the during construction erosion control measures would need to be biodegradable. So I appreciate the Watershed Council suggesting that, and we did get that in there. And then the last note, I just wanted to clarify that because there were some questions about access, both for emergency vehicles and impacts to traffic, and that the existing church driveway from Rusk Road, it's intended right now, I think, to be an entrance only. Obviously, by anecdote, people are still going out of it, and that is one of the reasons that one of the conditions that's being required as part of the proposal is to do physical structural things to that driveway to make it so you're going to have to work really hard and drive over things that you shouldn't be driving over to get out. So not only signage, but some additional curbing to narrowing that driveway so that it's only really comfortable for that one entrance movement. And additionally, perhaps a little bit of work in the road itself to establish a little bit of a median so that I can't make a left turn into it. So I think the hope and understanding was that in lieu of just closing that driveway, which would improve things even more, that would, limiting those kinds of movements would help a lot. Those were all the points I was going to make. So if you have other questions for me, I'm happy to take them.
Any other questions?
I just have one more clarifying one. So Clackamas County requires 8 feet on a bicycle path, and we require 10?
What's interesting about the comment that we got from the county on this was that they did note that, as I understood it, that their requirement, the minimum requirement for a two-way traffic bicycle path was 8 feet, but their recommendation was 10. And then the language of the condition that they presented to us was for a 10-foot path. And I believe a 10-foot width is also the city's standard as well as like a minimum for two-way bike traffic.
But the county's code is literally 8 feet.
That I can't say for sure because I haven't looked at it. I've only looked at the comment that they sent, where they indicate, what I understood it to indicate was that the minimum was 8 feet, but they recommended 10, and then they end up requiring.
And technically, the right-of-way of the bicycle path is in Clackamas County unincorporated, right?
Well,
the city doesn't own Rusk Road, the county does?
Right, the county has jurisdiction of Rusk Road, and And since it is, even though it's not, the path is, for the most part, not going to be in the right-of-way itself. A lot of it's going to be on the church property. But since it's still, I guess, maybe adjacent to the county roadway, I don't know if that means we would or should be deferring to their standard. But a lot of the path's going to end up on the private church property. But it's serving a public function. It needs a public access easement. I mean, it's going to be available to the public.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Okay. Everybody good? Going once, going twice. All right. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the public testimony portion of this hearing on file CU-2018-003. It's now closed. All right. No further testimony can be taken unless the public hearing is reopened. We will now discuss.
Chair Travis, may I make a suggestion that we ask the city to put back up that one slide to let us look at
criteria?
the decision?
Yeah,
It was the blue slide that
I think that's a great suggestion.
the one that I believe Commissioner Edge had the question about the.
Which particular, it was about the parking modification? Or what?
Well, I don't know, wasn't there a slide that kind of gave us the 4 or 5 questions and the.
Decision criteria.
Approval criteria, and there are several of those slides, so we'll have to.
Yeah,
There's the criteria for conditional use, for community service use.
Scroll through
Flip
it.
back, and that was 3 hours ago, Brett. Can we?
Here we go. Say when.
Start at the beginning and work through them.
Is that the first of the approval criteria slides?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. We'll start here, thank you.
Oh. Yeah.
So we have conditional use, community
Right.
service use.
So as a conditional use, even if they do have things to the public,
Cafe,
right? Because if you look at let's say a university or a small college, they have things that are open to the public too, and we consider that a conditional use. And it seems to be standard practice with senior living care facilities now to provide amenities that the public may or may not take advantage of, but certainly the residents there will. So I think as a community service use, this is perfectly acceptable and fine, even with Brett's other point. I think it may actually lend more to the transportation of this portion of it than it does to anything else, and parking.
okay. Well, how about we do this? How about we look at the conditions and talk through those and raise questions about the conditions? There's several pages. Page 53 through 61. We don't have to go in order, but if you have things that you want to talk about within these sort of categories, right? So there's, the site plan and the HCA and mitigation. Construction management plan. I mean, I don't know if we need to add something about, Brett was just talking about permanent erosion control, or does that fit within 1C?
Over on the same page. Page 53?
Page 53, yeah, 1C, which is under the construction management plan. So, I mean, I think, I'm not sure if we need to add something there. Brett wasn't really clear either. I don't think on that, if it's just during construction or if it's if that covers permanent erosion control.
I mean, the permanent erosion control is that the foliage grows.
Planting.
Yeah, and that they're sustained. And so the biodegradable part will allow it to degrade, and then you're left with what's planted there.
Right.
And that is, I think, the intended result.
Yeah. Okay. So there's no
Adequate.
material that's, okay, great, all right. Well, that's all I have in that section, but I don't know. Does anyone else have anything they want to talk about related to HCA, mitigation?
So
The applicant had asked with 1A that they thought that was vague in terms of how the shifting would occur. I'm generally agree with the proposal that how the stormwater facilities are just gradually moved around, but the applicant had asked if there was a way to make this condition more quantitative. Perhaps we could say as the revised proposal as presented to the commission.
Citing the exhibit.
Citing the exhibit.
Yeah.
I'm
Oh, I see what
generally
you're
okay
saying.
with the exhibit, with the exception that the 10 parking spaces is something that we should talk about.
That's my hang-up.
the 10 parking spaces that are not in the red in the north.
The 10 that they haven't moved, I think, should be moved. Counting there's 40 parking spaces adjacent to the building, which is, per the applicant's testimony, enough for the residents, the independent residents. The 10 that we would move we're not moving them very far, and those could presumably be for the visitors, and the visitors can walk across the street. So balancing the impact to the HCA and did I get that right? WQR and HCA. I think moving those 10 spots is a viable alternative, and that I would say that it is appropriate mitigation. They have not gone through the mitigation steps of avoiding impact before you minimize the impact and then mitigate the impact. That's clearly one that can be avoided by simply moving those 10 spaces.
I agree.
The other impacts due to the access road, I agree, can't be avoided.
So my question is that, do you think 139 parking spaces is too much or too little, or?
I have no findings to question the applicant's number.
Okay.
Personally.
So on my makeshift engineer scale, which is a piece of paper and a pen, I think you can get actually 8 spots into the west side entrance area. And so I'm kind of right there with you. When I look at this, there's potentially 8, maybe 6. You might take some of the grass out, but if parking is that important, so then you're potentially up to 46 around the building.
Yeah, I'm not sure that we want to specify that they must be against the building.
What I'm saying is that that there is actually more parking available around this building than, if we eliminate those 10 spots, there's still more parking.
Our condition could be that the stormwater facilities must be entirely outside of the HCA, and that the 10 spaces to the north must be moved outside of the HCA, and that is our condition. And that they can have some flexibility to put those spaces where it makes sense. To me, the pollinator area makes sense. To you, adjacent to the building in that little nook makes sense, but their engineers will need to have some flexibility.
Right, but if you're going to do a parking lot to the west, then that bioswale needs to move back up to the north.
Or further to the east. There's plenty of space in the pollinator area.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Want to do, and I just don't want to have to design that.
I got you.
Right,
I see what you're saying.
So which condition is that, and how would we rewrite that?
I think condition 1A would just say that all stormwater facilities and the 10 northernmost parking spaces must be
from the revised plan.
Revised plan. Those 10 remaining northerly parking spaces must be moved out of the HCA, and that all stormwater facilities must continue to be outside of the HCA, but
That's right.
not exactly per the exhibit if they needed to reconfigure it somewhat.
That's how I would put it.
It is certainly within our discretion to mandate that they are not it's not disturbing the HCA, but, it's kind of up to them if they want to just move or eliminate. Yeah.
So we could just say all stormwater facilities and parking must be outside of the HCA. And
Well, parking on the northern side.
Okay.
The parking spaces on the
specify
northern
that.
side of the access road.
Right, because there
nearest
are
the creek.
parking spots in the HCA.
Correct.
On the northern portion of that building.
Right. But
So
we're
we want to be,
north
are
of
the
the
outer
access.
parking, outer parking lot? The outer
The
parking
way
lot?
Joseph phrased it, Commissioner Edge, north of the access road.
Oh, I see. Yeah, north of the driveway or north of the access road. Gotcha.
Agreed.
Okay. Any additional discussion about that one?
Well, so then my question is that do we want to give them a range of parking spots just in case if they have to eliminate them?
I don't think we need to do
No.
that at all.
I think that given the conditions for the parking modification, or given the criteria for the modification, I think that we're pretty limited in what we can accomplish there, or what we can condition there. I mean, we kind of have to take the minimum number that they're willing to reduce below the minimum, to get, you know what I mean?
I got you.
They're asking for a certain number, and we can say that's okay, but we can't cut it even further.
Gotcha. Okay.
Okay. Ready to move on?
Yeah.
Okay.
Good job.
Let's move on to the bike path.
Yeah.
I think that's the next thing within this section. So that's 2C. The minimum width shall be 10 feet.
I'll go with 8. I'll go with the county's recommendation.
Well, the county recommended 10.
Their minimum is, or their max reduction is to 8, like that's the minimum width, but I'm okay with the minimum width of 8.
I think there's some compromise to be made here.
What facility, are there any bicycle facilities at all right there? I mean, is there a bike path or
There
a
is
bike
no,
lane or
but
anything?
there are no on-streets on
No
Kellogg Creek Drive.
Okay, so this is all new.
The biggest reason I'm willing to go minimum 8 is two-way traffic.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
Well, what I want to do is I want to avoid taking out too many trees.
Agreed, but 5-foot two-way bike path,
It doesn't
No way.
work.
That's not right.
I mean, people will be hitting the trees as they're trying to avoid each other.
I think of the, so I live by Stanley Park. It's like a 5-foot sidewalk, but we have a lot of two-way going, and when people walking their dogs, I'm just getting around off the path, and that's anecdotal, but put yourself on a two-wheeler going 15 miles an hour.
Yeah, I think we should avoid as much tree removal as possible.
There's no maneuverability for
Okay.
two-way.
So 8 feet is reasonable and we save trees.
Hope so.
If the preferred width is 10, should it be only 8 where necessary to save trees?
I think that's possible. Do some.
I mean, if the intent of being narrower than it needs to be is for a specific purpose, then
Right,
only
for the
where that
trees.
specific purpose is necessary
Yeah.
would you deviate from the recommended standard.
Is that acceptable practice to have varying?
Not that,
It's-
and it can happen. It's not totally common. 10 foot is national
Right.
recommendation
Right.
by AASHTO. So,
I mean, it's not intuitively my preference to have a varying width path as you go, but I'm just asking everyone's
Yeah.
opinion. Does that seem reasonable that if the standard is 10 and we only want to deviate from the standard to do for a specific purpose, then would we consider only allowing the deviation where it's necessary to accomplish that specific purpose?
I'm not stickler.
You know what would happen, because what I envision is that if you were to draw a straight line and you had 8 feet between two trees and you have a 10-foot path, what you're going to do is you're just going to end the path in front of the tree and then start it on the other side. So what you potentially do is you create a hazard of people constantly running into trees.
I don't know.
No, you just taper it, right?
I get it. I get it, but let's take it from a practical point. you know, you're going to build a 10-foot path, and then when there's a tree that's in the matter of your 8 foot, yeah, you might make a little bit of a barrier, but you have this tree that is still in the potential of your path. That's why I was just saying, if you can make it 8 feet, then you keep it a kind of a common width. I don't even know if 8 feet solves the situation not taking out any trees either.
I don't either. I'm skeptical, but I can't. A 5-foot two-way bike path, I cannot.
I mean, I'd be willing to say.
That is not practical at all.
A 10-foot bicycle path with the avoidance of taking out too many of the trees, if that's.
A 10-foot bicycle path that could be dropped to 8 feet where a tree is saved.
It's called wowing, right? It's what engineers do. But I don't know.
Sounds like, we're a little uncertain about.
Let's just leave it as is.
Leave it as 5 foot?
The city wants 10 feet, the
10
county
feet.
wants 10 feet.
Just do 10 feet.
For all we know, 8 feet requires the trees to get removed altogether. I don't know.
Right, I mean, that's kind of the
I
trick.
mean, we don't have
We just don't have the
specifics about
information.
each tree that's in.
Whether they're worth saving, we don't know.
Right.
Well, we can always continue the hearing and get that.
A straw poll, okay.
I would vote yes on either, to be honest.
I would too.
Super strongly about it.
The reason I accept minimum 8 is because if it helps mitigate tree removal. But I don't know.
Yeah, we don't know for certain, do we?
I think they said they designed it so that they wouldn't hit any trees.
I mean, we can, Chair, we can always just continue the hearing just for that specific question, too.
It's true.
Should we push on to the next one and see?
Let's push on to the next one. Earmark that one. So, any issues around frontage? I mean, we didn't really seem to have any questions or concerns about any of that. Let's see. I'm moving right along to the bike parking unless somebody's stopping me in between where we're at and
Bike
getting
parking's good.
over to 3H.
3H?
3H on page 56. I think 24 more bike parking spaces is excessive to me. Agreed.
I agree with that.
Agreed.
I'd agree with that.
I find 14 to be adequate.
Given the circumstances of the
I
site,
can
14
buy
is
that.
fine.
I also, I'm going to help you, Commissioner Edge. This is a commercial for-profit business. If the customers that live there want bicycle parking, I can guarantee you that from an economic profitable standpoint, they will build in more bicycle
They'll get in
parking.
there. Yeah.
It's not like we have to deal with the government where you have to go through a whole bunch of things just to get one bicycle stand approved. This is a private enterprise, and they can put them in fairly quickly if demand gets there.
Yeah, you ever lived in a condo? We tried to do that. It was hard.
I think you're right, and I think that the applicant testimony stated that in such a way if demand were exceeding.
I struggle with this because, I mean, even, in the apartment building that I lived in, they were taking over space out of the parking garage to convert parking spaces to more bike parking, and I realize that that's an all ages community and not, a retirement home or a senior living, but I mean, that's the trend. I mean, that's where things are going. And I've been reading this entire decade, we're in 2019. I've been reading since 2010 about, active seniors and how things are changing. The AARP publishes new literature every year talking about active seniors, and they're looking for new, amenities in these retirement communities and these, these communities where they can transition from independent to assisted living. And, they want to bring their bikes with them. They want to, they want to be more active. And so, I was reassured, I will admit, I was reassured by the applicant's comments that they, as a for-profit business, that they would be interested in making sure that their customers were happy. And, and I get how, I get how that works. But I've seen so many cases where the amount of bike parking that was put in is completely inadequate. And I think that we're going to see in these situations that there, this data isn't based on nothing. These reports that come out every year are not based on nothing.
Well, but so they're talking, I understand the data that you're reading, and the data that they provided, is 82 years old, 86 years old. The seniors, that's a broad 55 plus. So it's different, I think, when you're talking about certain age strata.
The context is specifically in the terms of what owner-operators of assisted living and independent living facilities should be considering, not you know what I mean? It's not just, the AARP is publishing something about all 55 plus, people wanting to bike more until they're 70 and then they're done. It's specifically about what these facilities should be offering as amenities.
And I get your point, right? If you only have 14 bicycle racks, what does that say to the residents? Hey, you know what, we don't really value your bicycle activity, and so, maybe that discourages them from doing bicycle. So what I'd like to do, I'd like to help Commissioner, how about we come up with a compromise and add 10 more bicycle spots to get it up to a total of 24 and not a total of 38.
I would entertain that compromise.
Yeah, sure.
I think it's fine. I guess also, if there's like staff or visitors, it's not just for the residents necessarily, but to accommodate.
And people may want to ride their bike from there since they have, we'll talk about it, but since they have this nice paved roadway and parking lot that they're going to have to dodge cars from to get down to the senior center, that maybe they are going to want to ride their bikes because it's a nice, short, easy bicycle ride. And what's 10 bicycle spots in the long scheme of the project?
So what is the finding that supports this condition? It says it's finding 16B.
Page.
We're almost there. 30,
40 or 48?
48. Wow, it's all the way up there.
So it's under, it's conditional use, it's,
Yep.
16,
Pedestrian access to convenient facilities. Oh, that's 16.3. Gosh, it's hard to find.
Where even is 16?
I think it's under the quality of project as a living environment for residents, so on page 42.
Yeah,
48.
Thank you, Brett.
Yeah, there we go. Open space and senior activity center.
okay, so 16 starts on 41.
I don't
A.
see B anywhere.
Oh, I'm looking at 3.
B, standards governing conditional uses. Yards, access to property.
Yeah, I guess I think that there could very well be some benefit to the seniors and the community to have these spaces, but I just don't think we need a condition. I think that if the spaces are needed, there's incentives in place for the property owners to provide them, and that's between the property owners and their customers.
I agree. I think 14 is plenty.
Yeah, I think that, I agree with the argument made by the applicant on this one. Not that I'm against some sort of compromise, but, these facilities, have residence councils. And my 92-year-old father is a resident of one of these places, and if you don't think that they won't come in and speak
They can make something happen, right?
they will speak their mind and tell you what they want.
Yep.
And I think that, the owners are going to respond to those customer desires. So
I'm
I don't
okay with
think that
that.
there's a downside of starting off with 14 and and letting the market forces decide which way they go.
And I would like to compromise on it as well. I'm not trying to be anti-compromise. I just think we need to be careful with the conditions that they are supported by a finding, and I'm not convinced that we've demonstrated that here.
Yeah, and so then my concern about resident bicycle parking, but that's intended for the residents, is that it should be indoor and secured as opposed to the 14 spaces that we provided outside close to the entrance. I mean, if you have a $1,000 bike or whatever, you're not going to want to, that you want to bring with you to your new independent living apartment. You're not going to be happy just storing that outside, even if it's covered.
Yeah, I understand that.
And so I'm struggling with, that for the benefit of the residents as a quality of living environment issue, that we would have some kind of indoor, secured indoor bicycle parking, so that if someone moved in with a bike or two, that they would, have somewhere safe to put it other than in their apartment.
But would you allow like a bicycle box or whatever those things are, outside bicycle box?
As a permanent parking spot for, I don't know. I wouldn't want to store my bike outside. It would end up in my apartment, in my way.
Well, right. Most people don't want to leave their bicycle outside, would generally take it into their place.
So what
But I understand what you're saying.
So this condition was saying that the additional spaces should be located in secure rooms inside the building, or at least be covered and conveniently located for residents. So what if we just said all the bike parking spaces should be located in secure rooms inside the building, or at least be covered and conveniently located? It doesn't get it.
I guess as I'm reading the wording on, the Planning Commission finds that at least 24, some number of biking spaces should be provided and that they should be located in secure rooms. That's not really objectionable. And when I read the way this is written, I move towards the compromise of 10 indoor
To 24.
spaces, from 24 to 10. Looking, it was really hard to find because it's not just 16B, it's 16B, 1, 3D. On page 46, as
Right,
discussed
I
in
see it.
finding 13-3, the applicant has proposed to provide 14 bicycle spaces. A minimum of 12 are required to serve visitors and staff. The proposed development is not a multifamily project, and the multifamily design guidelines are not technically applicable. It is reasonable to assume that some of the independent living residents may have bicycles and need a place to store them. Then we, the Planning Commission, find that it's written as 24 more biking spaces should be provided to serve 30% of the 78 independent living units, and that they should be located in a secure room. So our compromise is to say that 10 bicycle spaces to serve a minimum of 10% of the independent living units.
Right, so instead of 38, no, instead of 38, our number is 24.
Instead of 24.
24 more.
24
So there would be 14 outdoors for staff and visitors, and then 10 indoors for the residents.
I think it's important to preserve some outdoor parking.
That's that. Okay, I like that.
Yeah, I'm all right with that.
All right.
Good with that.
Provide at least 10 more bike parking spaces.
No, just 10 indoor parking spaces.
At least,
Additional spaces,
At
the
least
whole
10
condition.
At least 10. Yeah.
At least 10. The multifamily standard is one per unit. And so if you applied that logic here, it would be 78 spaces.
Right, which is ridiculous.
Which we're not asking them to do.
Right.
Because it's not a multifamily unit.
But
and
it's
those
still
standards don't apply.
a quality of living environment concern. Yeah, and so I'm just saying, it seems like even 24 is incredibly reasonable, but at least 10 is a suitable compromise.
Okay.
As long as they're indoor.
Okay.
10 indoor, 14 out.
Okay.
At least 10 indoor.
At least 10 more bike parking
They may
spaces.
eventually choose to provide more indoor, but at least we'll start with 10.
Okay.
All right, now I got to remember.
Those are the ones that I highlighted as,
We have that original thing was on page 58, right? The one that we're looking at to get our bearings straight.
this is 56 of the.
56, thank you.
conditions. Yeah.
Okay.
So my major desire with this development, and it's not something that's currently proposed as a finding or a condition, and we may not be able to get there, but I just really want the portion of the property north of the creek, the oak grove with the camas, and as much of the wetland as possible, really, I believe should be in public ownership, and it should be, or somehow integrated and managed with the adjacent park. When the brownstone proposal came in, North Clackamas had agreed to take on ownership of the western portion, and I don't know that there's anything that we can do here to mandate that that occurs, or even it would be appropriate for us to mandate it, but I would, it's just the right thing to do for the ecological function and the connectivity, and I just want to talk about that at some point.
I agree 100% with you, and I don't know if North Clackamas Parks actually signed off on that. I think what happened was that we wanted to see if they were agreeable.
They had agreed at the end to take ownership, and Brownstone had...
During the city council?
It occurred during the period between our first hearing and our second.
Okay, well, if
I don't
that...
know that anything contracted occurred, but
if that condition...
said that that was appropriate.
If that same condition can still be...
It was because we made it a criteria for an exceptional development. We said it would be exceptional.
So why don't we encourage that? Because here's although that I believe that a path to the north is the safest, really the better way to get your residents to the senior center, you build a path to nowhere because now you have to have North Clackamas Parks finish the other part of the path.
Or they build the path and then turn it over afterwards.
You still have to rely on North Clackamas Parks to build that other section of the path.
On their
property, no matter what. And so what that really does is it makes it problematic for us to ask them to build that path. Because actually what you're doing is you're putting the residents in a more treacherous situation because you can't guarantee the other side of the path. So that's why I like the idea of turning this over. We should encourage that negotiation.
Maybe that's
make it a recommendation. Make it a recommendation at the end to encourage talks with North Clackamas.
They've already expressed a willingness to do so, and the Parks District has expressed a willingness to, previously.
I wonder if now there's an opportunity to do that, like as we're adjusting the lot lines to carve off a separate lot to the west that would be something that could be turned over to the parks as, this whole western lot.
That's
and
an
if the
interesting
applicant
question.
would be, if we made a recommendation to the applicant to work with the city to evaluate
So then
adjustment.
are we actually allowed to do eminent domain here?
What?
No.
What are you talking about?
No.
So we can't redraw that lot line at all? Separate out two lots?
As a part of this application?
Not
No.
in the finding, what finding would...
So I think all we can do is make a recommendation that Bonaventure talks to North Clackamas Parks District
And my line of questioning about an asset or liability, I understand is clearly an asset to be adjacent to this beautiful natural area, but in terms of maintaining the property, maintaining the potential liability from people getting on board, the Parks District is better suited to manage that and still provide the same benefits to the property.
Right, and that's one of my problems is the development of what can happen around this, and that is my biggest worry, and so.
It's a shame the Parks District didn't take the opportunity to respond to this sooner. I guess their letter came in the last day, but...
No, well, Commissioner Burns, where would you put such a recommendation within here?
Does it become part of our approval, or is it a separate motion?
I think what we do is after we take the vote for what we decide, then we make a recommendation afterwards.
Okay.
With the understanding that that's a recommendation only.
Yes.
That's not a binding condition to any of the approval.
Right.
And so it might not happen.
Right.
Yep.
Okay. Okay. I'm going to need probably a motion to extend this meeting, I would assume.
It's 15 minutes enough?
10:15.
Motion to extend to 10:15?
Second.
I think that we can get
I don't know how much more we have to go.
Well, let's go
we're
ahead and
pretty
just
good
extend
on-
it. I don't want us to be rushed.
I'll second the 10:15.
Okay, thank you.
I think we're close.
I think we're close, but 10:15's our cutoff. Okay.
Do we need to vote on that?
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Okay. All right, you guys didn't find anything else? We'll have,
Height, the 4-story building. Nobody has any problems with that?
I want to go with that. I think 4 stories. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm fine with the height.
It was just a
I
few
liked
feet.
I liked that we asked.
Well, and I think it also shows that they actually looked at alternatives to stay out of the water quality and out of the, I'm pretty well accepting of this, is that they've stayed out of the habitat conservation area. They've done the mitigation that's required, and they've looked at alternatives.
I think so.
Because going up one more height and shrinking up the buildings and is just another example that they looked at that they just don't do and is not feasible, so.
Having Dow, the same consultant team involved here, is clearly shown through in the application. There's just a lot less for us to debate because the lessons learned from the brownstone are clearly incorporated here. And that makes this easier for us.
A lot of knowledge.
Yes.
It's been
I would like to ask for some sort of mitigation, though, to the north of the Turning Point Church parking lot, something besides just kind of leaving it that grass and maybe adding some more vegetation or something back in for.
I don't know that we can.
It's their.
Ask to make it a pollinator site or a garden site or.
I mean, we can ask, I guess, but, I mean, it'd be like the
That may
recommendation.
fall,
A finding.
You can't do that as a.
On-site mitigation. For
You can't do that as a trade-off for the habitat?
Well, I mean, again, there's rules about, the, trying to restore the, the habitat, the existing habitat conservation area where it would be needed as a priority. And, being closer to the water and everything would be the priority for the mitigation.
Right, but you can also mitigate outside of the habitat conservation area.
Yeah, but it's ranked.
I'm not prepared to, I don't think we have the knowledge and we didn't get any information presented to us to prioritize that area.
All right. Time to take one for the environment. You guys just shoot it right on down.
I want more pollinators.
No, I get it. I get, no, that's fine.
Heck, I should do that in my house.
so unless I hear anything else, then we need to go back to the bike path.
Sorry, I have 3.
Because that's unresolved.
The what?
The bike path.
Oh, right.
So I mean, I'm almost at this point in time where I would like to see a little bit more information on what the 10-foot, what the 8-foot, and what the 5-foot means to the removal of the
Consequences
trees.
of tree removal?
Yeah. But if we approve everything else except for that, at least we've given staff and Bonaventure the meat and potatoes of this thing to be able to move forward without, right? We can do that, pass everything without, and just leave that one question open?
Sure, you could vote on the other conditions and continue the hearing for that issue.
So that they can move forward and.
Well, they wouldn't be moving forward because we wouldn't be issuing a decision.
Yeah, the decision wouldn't happen until
you resolve the other issue.
So the only thing that we'd come back is just talk about that path.
Right.
And if you do look at.
You'll be gone by then, Sherry. Don't look at me that way.
If you look at sheet C101, of the plan set, you can see the trees that are impacted by the proposed 5-foot, showing one being removed. And so, we can't know what the impacts are of 8 or 10 feet, but based on the proximity, it appears there likely would be some additional trees.
Is there a sidewalk in
It's
addition
almost
to the bike
certainly-
path?
Almost certainly. What's that?
Is there a sidewalk in addition to the bike path?
Yes.
Then I'm fine with 5 feet if there's a sidewalk too.
But to clarify, the issue is that bike facility is supposed to serve for two-way traffic. There wouldn't be bikes on the sidewalk.
There shouldn't be bikes on the
But
sidewalk.
legally, there can be.
Not when there's a.
Not when there's an on-street designated.
Not when, is that what it is? So.
But there isn't one.
Right. So a path wouldn't qualify.
But we already have 10 feet of path with a 5-foot sidewalk and a 5-foot path.
We have a 5-foot.
Right, but they're separated by a grassy knoll.
We have 5-foot sidewalk.
I mean, it's not going to...
Still thinking of two-way bike traffic.
It's not going to be a super heavily
That was
used
still my
facility here. I'm
concern.
kind of running through my head with it. Most of the time, there won't be two bikes coming in two directions. Just be real here.
And if there is, one of them's going to slow down, right?
Yeah.
Well, they have to.
I'm inclined to just
It's
move
like the old
forward one
days,
way or
right?
another on this and not have to come back to this application.
I would like to move forward one way or another.
I'll move forward because I don't want to kill any trees anyway.
So
you're
5 foot?
Now we're back to 5 foot?
There's, I mean, I guess if there's a sidewalk and if
I'm just not comfortable putting bikes on the sidewalk.
I don't want bikes on the sidewalk, I don't like it.
Right, but the idea was, the worry of Commissioner Burns was, if somebody's on a skateboard or the rollerblades or somebody's walking a baby or something like that, 5 foot is not enough room to get a bicycle and a pedestrian out of the way. So his logic is that now there's a sidewalk, those people will be taking advantage of the sidewalk for sure and not be on the bicycle path.
It's not the worst thing.
Sorry, can I just, as a point of clarification, I'll ask the city attorney to check me on this. I mean, just a reminder that the proposed bike facility, it's a bike facility that is, even though it's going to largely be on the church property, is going to be within a public easement and needs to meet certain minimum standards. And so I would at least defer to
It wouldn't work.
8 feet then.
to at least the 8 foot.
That is the minimum.
That appears to have been in the county comments. I mean, that still doesn't meet the city standard. So when the city takes on that thing, it will be a substandard facility.
Yeah, I've gone by that assumption, honestly.
And the city is going to be in an IGA to manage the bike path, right?
I think the county's going to make us do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we would be putting you in the position
I'm
to,
going to want to put them in a position.
Then it's 10 feet and the trees go.
That's the problem.
Okay, I'm okay with that.
Do we know what kind of species those trees are?
I don't know exactly what kind of species they are. They're more of an ornamental kind
They
of.
do look like an ornamental tree, I would give you that.
And to clarify as well, I think with the understanding that the width would be 10 feet, I believe there's some language somewhere in the conditions that clarifies, or it's in the requirements section, that those trees right now serve the function of some perimeter landscaping, and the required trees planted one every lineal 40 feet in the church parking lot. And if any of them are removed, they'll have to be
mitigated.
replaced, because that would be taking the church parking lot further out of conformance
Well, I
from.
think a little differently.
you think a little differently? Is that what you said? Okay, well, what do you,
For two-way bike paths.
It's a 10 foot then.
all right,
Okay.
as is. So that one does not need to be reworked. That additional information is very helpful. I mean, we didn't talk about the sidewalk there, so that was very helpful. Any other outstanding issues here?
I know, I hear you. Look at John Henry, he's the one that always pulls one out at the end. Can you review the changes with us before we vote?
So the changes we have so far are condition 1A, and it would read something like, and hopefully Brett can help me too, from the revised site plan and all related plan sheets, shift off-street parking spaces and stormwater facilities out of the, and it's got to be the north parking lot
Parking lot's north of the...
to shift.
North
Yeah,
parking spaces.
Can I suggest what I was noting here?
Yes, please.
So it's going to be something like, from the revised plan received February 25th, revise all related plan sheets to shift all off-street parking spaces on the northern side of the northern access road and all stormwater facilities out of the HCA to reduce impacts.
Perfect.
Something like that.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you. You're the expert. He's the pro. Okay, so that was the change.
So when we make a motion, can we just refer to as stated by...
Yeah.
I will get that.
Okay.
The other.
We've done that before.
Yeah, we have done that before. And then we have the bike parking spaces, which is 3H, and that will be revised to say, in addition to the 14 bike parking spaces, revise the plans to provide at least 10 more bike parking spaces to serve whatever that percentage is that we don't know.
Yeah, we'll redo the percentage.
Thank you. Can't do math right now. The additional spaces should be located in secure rooms inside the building, period.
Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, just end it there.
Yep.
That's it.
And those are the only changes that we have.
And then our recommendation at the
And
end.
then our recommendation at the end.
Okay. So, Ms. Chair, I would like to make a motion to accept CU 201800-3 with the recommended findings and approvals, and with the additions to changes condition 1A and condition 3H.
Could you also reference the exhibits if you're comfortable with them?
And exhibits
1 and 2?
1 and 2.
I will second that.
Motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? All right. Motion carries.
Ms. Chair, I would also like to make a recommendation that the Planning Commission passes on to both Bonaventure and North Clackamas Parks District, that we highly recommend that North Clackamas Park District purchase or obtain the land to the west of the complex and east of their North Clackamas Park, including the Mount Scott Creek water corridor.
Water quality resource.
Water quality resource.
Second.
You satisfied with that? Okay. Cool. All right. All those in favor of adding that recommendation?
Aye.
Opposed? All right. Recommendation added.
So will staff turn that into some kind of formal letter that could be presented to North Clackamas Parks and Bonaventure, just something on the record that would be from the Planning Commission?
Yeah, we'll figure out what
A way to
vehicle
communicate
to do that. Yeah.
Very well.
All right. Thank you very much. If anyone wishes to appeal this decision to the City Council, you must make application stating the grounds for your appeal within 15 days of the mailing notice of the decision. Please see planning staff for details. Okay. Moving through the rest of the agenda, work session items.
Oh, God, no.
Can't handle that right now. Planning Department, other business updates.
No.
David's done.
Dave's like,
He's done.
I did it at the beginning just to get it out of the way. We're good.
Any Planning Commission committee updates or discussion items? I don't think there's been any meetings since our last meeting. Okay, so forecast for future meetings. On March 12th, we've got 2 hearings and a work session, and I'm sorry to report that I will not be here.
Oh, John Henry.
So,
I may not either. I
okay.
may have a conflict.
So I know for certain I won't be here, but we should still have a quorum even if you're not here.
Okay. I mean, I'll
So-
You
get,
can lose 3 and still have a
Yeah,
quorum.
okay. Okay, I'll be out of town, so,
I also may be in Ontario.
uh-oh.
Yeah.
Okay. Nobody else? Because that's, I mean, that's a continuation of
oh,
the
yeah.
It's a big one.
hearing,
There's
so-
some big decisions.
Yeah,
You can do it.
okay. Well, we'll just keep tabs on that, but,
We're glad you're on board, Robert.
yeah, thank you.
No problem.
And then,
Understand why everyone's leaving, huh?
I don't know if we have anything for March 26th that's come up, or is it still be TBD?
Yeah, I think the only additional land use applications didn't qualify for that date. We're pushed into April.
There actually may be one, the Elk Rock Estates application. I think Vera was deliberating today whether that was in position to
Okay.
move forward, because it was close.
Okay.
Possibly.
Possibly, okay. Okay, well, with that, I would just like to thank the audience for coming today. We had great testimony and participation from the applicant and the community, so I really appreciate that. And with that, I will ask for a motion to adjourn.
I move to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Adjourned.